In the quiet of the night, the once feared Yakuza boss walks alone, his empire in ruins, haunted by the ghosts of his past. As the weight of his choices presses on him, he wonders if redemption is even possible, or if it's too late to escape the shadow he's cast. The boy was born in the dead of night, the moon casting a cold silver light on the streets of Osaka. His first breath wasn't greeted by the soft cooing of a loving mother, but by the muted sounds of whispers and footsteps in the dark. The air was thick with the scent of rain, the kind of rain that washed everything clean, leaving behind only what was meant to stay. And in that moment, he was marked by blood, by legacy, and by a family whose name carried weight like the sharp edge of a blade. His father, a high-ranking member of the Yakuza, he stood outside the hospital door, smoking a cigarette, the smoke curling up like tendrils of a long-forgotten promise. He didn't smile when the nurse handed him his son. There was no joy, no rush of warmth that would typically come with the birth of a child. He only nodded, his dark eyes unreadable, as if the boy had already been written into the ledger of his life. Honor, it seemed, was already carved into his bones. The Yakuza code was simple, yet brutal. Loyalty above all else, blood above all else, and above all, the family. The boy would grow up with these words etched into his heart, his every step weighed down by expectations that could crush a lesser soul. There would be no childhood here. He wouldn't learn to play games or chase butterflies. Instead, he would learn how to walk the tightrope of survival. From his earliest days, he was surrounded by men who had traded their souls for power, men who spoke in low tones, their voices thick with the weight of their own secrets. They didn't play with the boy. They taught him to sit still, to watch, to listen. Every word spoken around him was a lesson in trust, a lesson in betrayal, a lesson in the price of power. The boy's mother, a soft-spoken woman with eyes that held secrets of their own, would cradle him at night, whispering lullabies that were more like prayers. But even in her embrace, there was a chill in the air. She knew what her son would become. She had no choice but to accept it. In the darkness of their home, tucked away in the heart of the city, the boy learned early that there was no room for weakness. When he was only 5, his father took him to the family's hideout, an old, run-down building on the edge of town. There, he witnessed the first of many things that would shape him into the man he would one day become. A brutal display of power, an act of retaliation against a man who had dared to cross the family. His father didn't flinch. His face remained as impassive as stone. The boy, wide-eyed, watched the scene unfold, the blood spattering across the floor, the cold finality in the air. There was no turning back from this life. As he grew older, the boy's name would echo in the underworld, whispered in reverence and fear. He was the son of the Yakuza, and the bloodline that ran through his veins would shape his every action, every decision. His destiny was written in a language only a few could understand, and it was a language that would haunt him until his final breath. As the years passed, the weight of the family's legacy settled heavier on the boy's shoulders. His father, once a towering figure in the Yakuza, began to show cracks in the armor, a slow erosion that could not be ignored. The tight grip he once had over the streets of Osaka was loosening, the rival factions sensing weakness like vultures circling a dying beast. The old man's movements grew sluggish, his once sharp mind clouded by years of ruthless rule. He no longer walked the streets with the same certainty, the same power. He began to rely more on his son. The boy, now a young man, sat at his father's side in dimly lit rooms, listening to conversations that often spiraled into bitter arguments. The room was thick with smoke, the silence broken only by the occasional tap of a cigarette against an ashtray. His father's gaze, once sharp as a blade, now seemed clouded, distant, as if he were looking at something that no longer existed. The boy knew the time was coming, the time when he would have to step into his father's shoes, when the family's power would pass to him. The idea of inheriting this empire didn't sit well with him. He had grown up watching men fall, watching blood stain the pavement, watching power shift hands like cards in a dealer's game. He knew the rules he had been taught them from his first breath, but as he stood on the edge of this great chasm, the weight of the life he had been born into felt heavier than ever. The promise of power, once a distant dream, was now an unavoidable reality. One evening, his father sat him down in their private quarters, a room filled with trophies from a life lived in blood. There were photographs of men long dead, plaques of recognition that seemed like relics of another time. His father's voice, raspy from years of chain smoking and too many late nights, spoke the words the boy had known would come. "It's your turn now. You're the future. You'll hold the reins of this family when I'm gone." The boy felt a coldness spread through him. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but something in him recoiled at the thought. The life his father had built was a house of cards, one that could collapse with a single wrong move. He wasn't ready. He had spent his youth avoiding this very thing, yearning for something different, anything different. But there was no escape. The Yakuza blood ran too deep, its demands too strong. His father's hand, once firm and steady, now rested weakly on his shoulder. The boy swallowed, knowing that in the coming days, the final pieces would fall into place. He would take his father's place at the head of the family, whether he was ready or not. And as he looked into his father's tired eyes, he realized with a sinking heart that the shadow of the man he had been born to replace would follow him wherever he went, a ghost that could never be outrun. The first time he truly understood the power of silence, it came like a strike in the dark, swift and without warning. The boy, now a young man, sat in a room thick with tension, the low murmur of voices rising and falling like distant waves. His father's men were gathered around the table, their faces stoic and unreadable, each of them bound by something stronger than blood. The boy watched, learning the weight of every glance, every shift in posture. There were no words to be spoken here, only understanding passed in silence. He had heard it all before, the stories of loyalty, of how the Yakuza lived and died by the code. But as he sat there, surrounded by men who had given everything for the family, it became clear that true power wasn't in the size of one's weapon or the strength of their influence. It was in the ability to command the room without uttering a single word. His father had mastered this, and soon it would be his turn. A sudden shift in the room caught his attention. One of the men, a trusted lieutenant, stood up, a barely perceptible gesture, a slight tilt of his head that no one but the boy noticed. Without a word, another man across the room stood as well, their eyes meeting briefly in the silence before the first man left the room. It was all a message, unspoken yet understood. The lieutenant had received an order. He wasn't asked to do anything. He was simply told, with nothing more than a gesture. And the man had accepted it, without question, without hesitation. That was the power the boy had to learn to wield. As the days passed, he began to understand the weight of the oath that bound them all. In this world, words were cheap, easily manipulated. But silence was sacred. To speak was to break the bond, to break the trust that held the Yakuza together. Loyalty wasn't proven by grand speeches or promises. It was proven in the stillness of one's actions, in the way a man moved, the way he responded when there was nothing to say. One night, his father took him aside, the weight of years in his tired eyes. He spoke little, his voice rough, but the meaning was clear. The code is everything. If you break it, you break us all. The world won't care if you're blood. They won't care if you're family. The moment you show weakness, it's over. The boy nodded, but the words stuck with him. Weakness wasn't something that could be seen. It was something that would be felt. Power wasn't in the loudest voice in the room. It was in the ability to control the silence, to know when to speak and when to let the quiet hold dominion. And as he moved deeper into the life his father had led, he understood that every unspoken command carried the weight of death. A glance, a nod, a shift in stance. These were the weapons of true power, and they were sharper than any blade. It happened on a humid summer night, the air thick with the promise of violence. The boy, now a young man, had been following his father's footsteps with steady determination, learning the ways of the Yakuza with every passing day. He had watched the rituals, heard the stories, but there was something different about tonight. Something was in the air, electric, charged with the kind of tension that could break a man or forge him into something else entirely. The street was narrow, lined with neon signs flickering like dying embers. His father's men were gathered at the corner, their voices low, their eyes scanning every movement. It was a routine, a meeting with an old acquaintance, a rival, a man who had been causing trouble in the area. But trouble, in their world, was never left unchecked. The boy stood off to the side, trying to stay unnoticed, his back pressed against the cool brick wall. He had seen the underworld from the shadows, but never this close, never with his blood pulsing in his ears, a part of it now, whether he liked it or not. The rival, a man with a face like a crumpled sheet of paper, approached with his men. There were no formal greetings, no exchange of pleasantries. This was business. And business in the Yakuza world was always settled with power, always settled with blood. The words were few, clipped, like knives thrown at each other, each one cutting a little deeper than the last. And then, as always, something snapped, a shout, a shove, and the tension exploded like an unseen bomb. The boy had seen men fight before. He had heard the stories, seen the wounds, but nothing prepared him for the sound of fists meeting flesh, the sickening thud of bone on bone, the guttural grunts of pain and rage. He tried to pull back, tried to stay in the safety of the shadows, but then his father's voice cut through the chaos. "Get in there," his father commanded, his tone sharp as a whip. The boy froze for a moment, the weight of the command heavy on his chest. But this was his moment, the one he had been waiting for, the test. He couldn't refuse. Not now. With a surge of adrenaline, he pushed forward into the fray, his hands instinctively finding their place. A man came at him, swinging a wild punch. The boy didn't think, didn't hesitate. His body moved before his mind could catch up. He ducked, slid to the side, and slammed his fist into the man's stomach. The impact knocked the air from his lungs, and the man crumpled, gasping for breath. The boy's heart raced, his pulse thumping in his ears. He had done it. He had struck, and the taste of blood, the realization that it was his fist that had caused the man to fall, was a sharp, metallic taste in his mouth. It was power, power like he had never known before. In that moment, he understood. The Yakuza's strength wasn't in their money or their connections. It wasn't in the grand gestures of loyalty. It was in the blood spilled on the streets, the blood that made others kneel, the blood that made them feared. The Yakuza didn't just own the city, they owned the fear in people's hearts. And now, the boy owned a piece of it. The night was cold, the city's neon glow barely breaking through the fog. The boy stood at the entrance of the warehouse, his heart pounding with the weight of what was to come. He had spent his whole life in the shadows of the Yakuza, learning, watching, waiting for this moment, the moment when he would take the final step into the family. But now that it was here, the boy felt a knot twist in his stomach, an unease that even the silence of the night couldn't ease. His father had said little about what would happen tonight. The world of the Yakuza was one of few words, but many rituals. His father's eyes, once proud and unyielding, had softened just slightly when he spoke to him earlier, the hint of something approaching pride in his voice. "Tonight, you prove yourself," his father had said. "Tonight, you become a part of us." The boy swallowed hard. a knot forming in his throat. This wasn't a simple ceremony. The Yakuza didn't take lightly the act of letting someone into their ranks. No, tonight would seal his fate forever. The men inside this room were more than just family. They were warriors, killers, and masters of loyalty. If he faltered, if he hesitated, he would be nothing more than a ghost, discarded in a world that showed no mercy. The door creaked open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of smoke and sweat. A circle of men stood around a low table, their eyes cold, assessing. His father, seated at the head of the table, motioned for him to step forward. Without a word, the boy obeyed, his every step a weight he could feel in his bones. He had been trained for this, but nothing could have prepared him for the gravity of the moment. A single man stepped forward, his face scarred and unshaven. The boy recognized him. He was a legend, a warrior who had carved his own bloody path through the streets. The man placed a katana in the boy's hands, its blade cold and unforgiving. He nodded, signaling for the boy to kneel. The boy did, the weight of the katana heavy in his grip. The room was silent, every eye on him. The ritual was simple, yet profound. The man with the katana spoke, his voice low and measured. "You swear your loyalty to this family. You give your blood, your life, to the Yakuza, no matter the cost." The boy didn't hesitate. He had seen this done before. He had watched his father, his uncles, all pledge themselves to the family. He raised the blade to his palm and, without a second thought, pressed it into his skin. The pain was sharp, but not as sharp as the realization that this was no longer a choice. This was the Yakuza. His blood was now theirs. As the blood trickled down his hand, the man nodded. "It's done," he said. And with those words, the boy knew that everything had changed. He had crossed the line, taken the oath, and sealed his fate. Tonight, he wasn't just a son. Tonight, he was family. The Yakuza's blood ran through him, and he would never escape it. The boy had always believed in the concept of family. It was a simple idea to him when he was young, the bond between his mother, his father, and himself. But now, as a member of the Yakuza, the word began to mean something entirely different. It wasn't just blood that made a family. It was loyalty. It was the unspoken bond that tied one man's life to another's. In the world of the Yakuza, family was more than a name. It was a way of life. He had been taught to trust the men who stood by his side, to view them as brothers, and in some ways, he did. But there were moments, small and fleeting, when doubt crept in. The deeper he went, the more he saw the cracks beneath the surface. He watched as alliances shifted, men who once swore loyalty to one another now plotting against each other in dark corners. He saw the fear in their eyes when they spoke of betrayal, the guilt that clouded their judgments when they were forced to do things that were impossible to undo. Yet even in those moments, he never wavered in his loyalty to his father. His father had always been a figure of unwavering strength, a man who had built everything they had with blood and sweat. He had led them all with a steady hand, unshaken by the chaos that often surrounded them. And it was because of this man that the boy understood what it meant to belong to the Yakuza. It wasn't about blood. It was about loyalty, about standing together through the worst storms, about ensuring the survival of the family at any cost. The boy had seen the sacrifices that came with this loyalty. He had witnessed men give their lives without a second thought, their faces set with a grim determination, their families left to carry on in silence. It was a price they paid for belonging, for being part of something greater than themselves. The boy knew that one day, he too would face that price. He understood now that the bond between his father and the men who served him was built on the belief that no matter what happened, no matter what they had to endure, they would protect each other. But what the boy had not yet understood, what he had yet to grasp fully, was the weight of what it meant to lose that loyalty. His father had warned him, of course, but the boy hadn't been able to comprehend the full cost. It was one thing to give everything for the family. It was another to watch as it slowly crumbled from within, piece by piece, as the men you trusted began to turn on you. He had learned by then that the Yakuza wasn't a family in the traditional sense. There was no unconditional love here. There was only loyalty, and when that loyalty was broken, there were no second chances. Family wasn't forever in this world. It was a fleeting thing, a fragile thread that could snap at any moment. And the boy was beginning to realize that the only family he could truly trust was the one he had made for himself. The boy stood in the dimly lit room, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like 1,000 pounds. His father's words echoed in his mind, sharp and clear. In the Yakuza, honor is everything. Without it, you are nothing. But as he looked at the man kneeling before him, blood pooling beneath him, the true meaning of honor seemed far less clear. The man had been a trusted ally, someone who had served the family for years. They had shared meals, fought side by side, and broken bread after every battle. But now, in this cold, unforgiving moment, the man was on his knees, his hands bound. His eyes were wide with fear, pleading for mercy. The boy had grown up hearing stories about the importance of honor, about how it was the foundation of everything, the Yakuza way, the family, their strength. Yet in this room, surrounded by the tension of betrayal and the scent of sweat, he wasn't sure what honor even meant anymore. The reason the man knelt before him was simple enough. He had betrayed the family. He had sold information to a rival clan, compromising the Yakuza's most sensitive operations. A breach like this could not go unpunished. His father had entrusted the boy with this task, the task of upholding their honor. And in doing so, the boy was to make a choice, to follow the law of the clan and exact punishment, or to find mercy, perhaps risking everything they had built. The boy's fingers trembled as he held the blade. The metal gleamed in the low light, but it felt colder than it ever had before. He had been taught that loyalty was above all, that any sign of weakness or hesitation would destroy them all. Yet looking at the man who had once been his ally, his conscience screamed at him to stop, to look for some shred of humanity in this brutal tradition. Could mercy, could forgiveness, have a place in the world he had sworn allegiance to? But then the memory of his father's stern face, the sacrifices made, the blood spilled for the Yakuza, flooded his mind. Honor could not be compromised, not even for the faintest whisper of mercy. To turn away from this, to spare this man's life, would make him just like every other weak soul who had failed the Yakuza. It would be an admission that he, too, was not worthy of the family's trust, of the power that came with their name. The boy closed his eyes, exhaled slowly, and in that breath, the decision was made. Honor was a burden that could crush a man if he allowed it, but there was no room for weakness in this world. His hands were steady as he lifted the blade. With one swift motion, the boy's world shifted. He had crossed the line, and there was no going back now. He had upheld the honor of the clan, but in doing so, he had sacrificed a piece of his own humanity. The phone call came late at night, its ring slicing through the stillness of the boy's apartment. He had just returned from a long day spent in meetings, his mind a tangled web of calculations and commitments. He had learned to bury his weariness beneath layers of duty. The Yakuza did not show weakness, and he had learned early on to mask his exhaustion with the same stoic resolve that defined the family. The voice on the other end of the line was gruff, sharp with the kind of urgency that made the boy's stomach tighten. It was one of his father's old associates, someone who had been around since before the boy was born. "The time has come," the man said. "You need to meet with them. They want their payment, and they're not the type to wait." The boy's pulse quickened. He knew exactly who the "they" were. The Gokudo. a powerful rival clan that had been an enemy of the Yakuza for as long as he could remember. His father had always said that the Gokudo were the kind of people you never crossed loyalty to them, was unyielding, and their wrath was something to be feared. But the boy also knew that the debts his father had racked up over the years were like a shadow, looming and inevitable. No one escaped their reach, not even the mighty Yakuza. The deal was long overdue, a debt that had been passed down like a cursed heirloom. Now it was his turn to make good on it. The boy had always known this day would come, the day he would have to make a choice that would challenge his very identity. To keep the Yakuza standing, to maintain the power and respect they had fought for, he had no choice but to pay the price. But in doing so, he was forced to work with the very people who had always been his enemies. The meeting was set for the following evening. The boy arrived at the dilapidated building on the outskirts of the city, its walls graffiti-covered, its windows dark. The Gokudo were waiting for him inside, sitting at a table covered in smoke and silence. The room felt colder than it should have, as if the weight of the debt had settled into the very bones of the building. He sat across from them, his gaze steady, but his heart pounding in his chest. The leader of the Gokudo, a man with eyes as cold as stone, slid a stack of papers toward him. The deal was simple enough work for the Gokudo. Leverage the Yakuza's resources to strengthen their position, and in return, the debt would be forgiven. But the boy knew that nothing in this world was truly simple. They were not forgiving. They were opportunistic. And by accepting their terms, he was inviting danger closer. The boy clenched his jaw, signed the papers, and sealed his fate. There was no turning back now. He had made a deal with the devil, and the Yakuza's future would now be tied to a rival clan. As he left the building, the weight of the decision hung over him, a debt that could never truly be paid, only transferred. The path ahead was darker than before, and he had just opened the door to a future he could not control. The air in the bar was thick with cigarette smoke, the faint hum of low conversation filling the corners of the dimly lit room. The boy sat at the back, nursing a drink he hadn't touched, eyes scanning the faces of the men around him. The Yakuza didn't trust easily, and tonight, neither did he. He had learned long ago that in this world, it was safer to listen than speak, to watch than act. But as the door swung open, he froze. The figure that walked in was a shadow from his past, a face he had hoped would never resurface. Kaito, a former Yakuza member who had once been a brother to the family, a loyal soldier. But that had been before he disappeared, vanishing without a trace years ago, leaving only whispers behind him, whispers of betrayal, of secrets buried deep in the darkest corners of the family's past. Kaito's eyes scanned the room until they locked on the boy. There was no mistaking the recognition in his gaze, nor the coolness that followed. It wasn't the reunion the boy had imagined. Kaito's presence wasn't a welcome one. He had left under suspicious circumstances, and no one in the family ever spoke of it, not even his father. To bring it up now felt like a betrayal of its own, an open wound that would never heal. The boy didn't stand as Kaito approached. Instead, he sat still, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. Kaito's voice, low and calm, broke the silence between them. "You've grown. Still don't speak much, huh?" The boy met his gaze. There was something unsettling in Kaito's eyes, something darker than the man he remembered. He couldn't quite place it, but it gnawed at him. "You know why I'm here," Kaito continued, pulling up a chair without waiting for an invitation. "There are things that need to be addressed. The Yakuza is in danger, and it's not just from our enemies." The boy's heart clenched. The words felt like a warning, but his mind raced, trying to make sense of the tangled mess Kaito was offering. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever Kaito had to say, it wouldn't come without a price. "What's your game?" the boy asked, his voice betraying none of the confusion that threatened to rise in his chest. Kaito smiled, but it wasn't the same smile he remembered. It was colder, sharper. My game? You're still thinking in terms of loyalty. You're still thinking like your father. But the world's changed, boy, and you've got to decide whose blood is thicker, the blood of your family or the blood of your enemies. The boy felt his pulse quicken. Every instinct told him to stand, to walk away from this conversation before it tore everything he knew apart. But Kaito's presence was magnetic, pulling him deeper into a web he wasn't sure he wanted to be caught in. You know where your loyalties lie, the boy replied, his words firm but unsure. With my blood. Kaito leaned in, eyes narrowing. Loyalty doesn't always mean survival. The boy was torn. The whispers of betrayal grew louder now, and the truth behind Kaito's disappearance seemed darker with every passing second. The night was colder than usual, the wind carrying a chill that seemed to seep into the very bones of the boy as he walked through the quiet streets. He had been summoned to a meeting, an urgent one, but the feeling gnawing at his gut told him that something was off. It wasn't the first time he had been called in for a late-night gathering, but tonight the air felt different, heavy with anticipation. As he entered the building, the lights were dim, casting long shadows across the walls. There, in the center of the room, stood his mentor, Takashi, the man who had taught him the ways of the Yakuza, the man who had shown him what loyalty truly meant. Takashi was calm as always, but tonight, his usually unshakable demeanor seemed slightly off. His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, held something the boy hadn't seen before: uncertainty. Sit down, Takashi said, his voice low, but with an edge the boy hadn't expected. The boy took his seat, waiting for his mentor to speak. Takashi didn't waste time. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing. We've been betrayed. The words landed like a blow. Betrayed? It didn't make sense. The Yakuza didn't simply betray their own. Honor was everything. The thought of it felt like a crack in the foundation of everything he had believed. Takashi continued, his face hardening. One of our own, a family member, has turned against us. They've made a deal with the Gokudo. They've been feeding them information, selling us out. The boy's breath caught in his throat. The Gokudo, the very clan they had been at war with for years. The thought that someone within their own family had betrayed them was beyond comprehension. Who? The boy asked, his voice barely a whisper. Takashi didn't answer immediately, instead casting a long, calculating look over the boy. The silence hung in the air, thick and suffocating, before Takashi finally spoke. It was Kaito. The boy's world seemed to spin. Kaito, the man who had once been a brother to him, had turned against them. It didn't make sense. Kaito had been part of the Yakuza for years, trusted by all. The boy felt the floor beneath him shift as the weight of the betrayal pressed down on his chest. His mind raced, his thoughts clouded with disbelief. I thought you should know first, Takashi said, his tone now colder. We have to act quickly. The Gokudo will come after us now, and when they do, we'll need to show them the price of betrayal. The boy's hands clenched into fists. The truth hit him with a force that left him breathless. Loyalty, honor, and family. They were all lies, fragile constructs built on promises that could be shattered in a moment. He was beginning to understand the true price of loyalty, and it was a price higher than he had ever imagined. Takashi stood, his gaze locked on the boy. You know what has to be done. The boy nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no turning back now. The Yakuza was at war with itself, and no amount of bloodshed could cleanse the stain of betrayal. The boy had seen the streets stained with blood, the alleys whispering of deals made in shadows, but nothing prepared him for what lay beneath the surface. He had been trained to move through the city, to feel its pulse, but now he was being thrust deeper, into places where the law didn't exist, where power wasn't spoken, but exchanged in whispers. The meeting had been set. The air was thick with anticipation, the smell of burning incense mixing with the musky scent of sweat and fear. The The boy stood at the door of a nondescript warehouse, hidden deep within the industrial district, his hand resting on the cold metal of the doorknob. This was where the real Yakuza business happened, where guns were bought and sold, where the underground world collided with the surface, and where corruption festered in the most dangerous corners of society. Inside, men from every corner of the globe filled the room. Russians, Chinese, Koreans, each as dangerous as the next, their eyes filled with the kind of cold indifference only the underworld could breed. The boy had been told that this was where his true test would begin, not with a gunfight or a blood feud, but with the subtle art of negotiation, of survival. The Yakuza's dealings with the illegal arms trade were carefully calculated, but it was a game that demanded more than strength. It required understanding, manipulation, and, above all, silence. He moved through the crowd, past crates of weapons stacked high, past men who exchanged looks that spoke volumes but never words. His mentor had warned him that the real danger wasn't in the guns or the money. It was in the men who traded in both. Corrupt officials who wore suits by day and made deals in back rooms by night. Gangsters who smiled as they shook hands, but the trust in those handshakes was as fragile as glass. He was approached by a man he didn't recognize, his face obscured by the shadows but his presence undeniable. "You're the boy from the Yakuza," the man said, his voice a rasping whisper. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. The boy nodded, offering nothing more. Words weren't needed. In this world, silence was often more dangerous than any weapon. The man stepped closer, the tension between them palpable. "You want weapons? You want power?" he asked. "Then you will learn what loyalty truly costs. Trust no one but your family, and even they can betray you." His eyes flicked to a crate nearby, and the boy followed the motion, his stomach twisting at the sight of crates filled with explosives, machine guns, and ammunition. "You'll see," the man continued. "This is where it begins, not with a fight, but with a choice. A choice to give your soul for survival." The boy's heart raced, but his face remained calm. He had crossed into the heart of the underworld, where loyalty was nothing but currency and survival was the only thing that mattered. The lines between friend and enemy blurred in these shadows, and as the boy took his first step into this new world, he realized just how far he had fallen. The boy had always known that power came at a price, but he had never understood the true cost until now. The Yakuza's influence had spread through every part of the city, like ink spilling across paper, staining everything it touched. He had started with nothing, just a boy with a dream of respect, a thirst for power. Now, as his name whispered through every corner of the underworld, he realized how much of himself he had sold along the way. The meetings had become more frequent, more urgent. The phone calls, the texts, the endless hours of sitting in rooms full of men whose faces were half hidden in shadows. They spoke of alliances, of business ventures, of expanding their reach. It was all a game of chess, and he was playing against the best. The more successful he became, the more distant he felt from the world he once knew. His family, the ones who had raised him, who had shown him the way, were slipping through his fingers. He hadn't seen his mother in months, and his father, well, his father was a ghost, lost in his own struggles. The boy could feel the walls closing in, the heavy weight of his position suffocating him. He stood on the rooftop of one of the family's many properties, staring out over the city. The lights flickered like distant stars, but they no longer held the warmth they once did. Beneath the surface of the polished streets and high-rise buildings, he knew the truth. The city was built on corruption, on fear, on broken promises. And now, he was part of that machine. The phone rang again, pulling him from his thoughts. He answered without hesitation. "What is it?" The voice on the other end was cold, calculated. "We have a problem. The Gokudo is making moves. They're trying to break our territory, undermine everything we've built. We need to act, and we need to act now. The boy listened, the familiar adrenaline coursing through his veins. Another battle, another war to fight. It was all part of the game. But as the words left the other man's mouth, something shifted within him. The weight of it all, the violence, the betrayal, the distance from everything he once held dear began to press down on him like a vice. He hung up and let the phone slip from his hands. The sound of it hitting the floor, a sharp reminder of how far he had fallen. Power had taken everything from him, his loyalty, his sense of self, even his family. The deeper he went into the world of the Yakuza, the further he found himself from the people who had once been his life. The choice was clear now. He could keep climbing, keep fighting, and keep winning. But at what cost? He had reached the top, but the view from here was colder than he had ever imagined. And he wasn't sure if he could face the price anymore. The boy had always believed in the concept of honor. It was ingrained in him from the start, a guiding principle passed down by his father, by the older men in the clan, who spoke in low voices about the sacrifices made in the name of loyalty. But now, standing at the precipice of his own choices, honor felt like an illusion, a delicate thread that could snap under the weight of the world he had built. The mission was simple on paper. A rival gang had crossed the line, disrespecting the Yakuza in a way that couldn't go unpunished. A message had to be sent swift, decisive, and brutal. It was his job to lead the charge, to show the world that the family's strength was unshakable. But as the plan unfolded, something gnawed at him. The faces of the men he was sending to do the dirty work. Their loyalty was unquestionable. But were they really the right ones for this? The night before the hit, the boy found himself in the quiet corner of the family's private room, the weight of his decisions pressing down like a storm. His closest allies, men he'd bled with, now looked at him with a mix of admiration and caution. They knew the price of his choices, the lives that would be lost, the blood that would stain his hands. But there was no turning back now. The mission went as planned, or at least it seemed to. The men struck hard and fast, their enemies caught off guard. The sound of gunfire echoed in the streets, a harsh reminder of the world they inhabited. But as the boy walked through the aftermath, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The bodies littered the ground, faces twisted in terror, and among them, he saw someone he never thought he would, a familiar face, a friend. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The rival gang had been a cover, a false target. The real betrayal was within his own ranks. One of his closest allies, a man he had trusted above all others, had orchestrated the entire thing, had used the mission to settle old grudges, to secure his own position. Blood had been spilled, lives had been lost, but the honor they had fought for, it had been nothing more than a lie, a construct built to mask the ugliness beneath. The boy stood in the middle of the chaos, his heart heavy with the weight of the choices he had made. He had followed the path laid before him, taken the steps his father had once taken, but now he wondered if that path had been a road to nowhere. Honor, loyalty, those ideals had become hollow words, empty echoes in a world that chewed men up and spat them out. The boy turned away, knowing there was no way to undo the damage. He had crossed a line that could never be erased, and now, the true cost of his honor was clear. The blood that stained his hands would never wash clean. The streets had never been more dangerous. The tension in the air was palpable, thick like smoke from a fire that had already claimed too much. It started with whispers, small cracks in the foundation of the Yakuza, a family once united under a single, ironclad code. But now, those cracks had spread like a wildfire, engulfing everything in its path. Rival families, once held in check by a delicate balance of fear and respect, had finally erupted into full-scale war. The boy stood at the center of it all, caught between loyalty to his bloodline and the reality of the battlefield. His hands trembled, Not from fear, but from the weight of the decisions he was being forced to make. Every move, every word, every action could tip the scales toward destruction, and yet he had no choice. War was here, and it would claim everything in its wake. The first strike came at dawn, a brutal ambush that took out 2 of his men before they even had a chance to react. The sound of gunfire echoed in the streets like the beginning of a storm. The boy's pulse quickened, his instincts kicking in as he barked orders to his men. There was no time for hesitation, no time to think, only time to act. The family's territory was under attack, and he would not let it fall without a fight. The chaos of the streets was overwhelming. Blood stained the concrete, the sounds of violence vibrating in his ears. He moved through the carnage like a shadow, his mind focused, calculating. Every step was a step toward victory, but each step also brought him closer to losing everything. It was a game of survival now, and he had to play it with ruthless precision. At one point, the boy found himself face to face with a man he had once considered a brother. The old loyalty, the brotherhood forged in the fires of their youth, now felt like a distant memory. The man had betrayed him, switched sides for the sake of power. It was an easy decision, but it didn't make it any less painful. One shot, that was all it took. The man's eyes were wide with surprise, but there was no time for remorse. As the war raged on, the boy became numb to the bloodshed. His hands were soaked with the weight of his choices, but the victory he sought seemed farther away with each passing minute. The streets were littered with bodies, and the echoes of gunfire had long since become a soundtrack to his existence. But it wasn't just the violence that haunted him, it was the question that gnawed at him in the dead of night. How much of himself had he lost to this war? How much of his soul would remain once the dust settled? The boy had won, for now. His family's territory had been reclaimed, and the rival clans lay in ruin. But the price was steep. His world was fractured, his relationships broken. As he stood over the smoldering ruins of the battlefield, the boy understood one thing clearly. In this world, victory and defeat were indistinguishable, and both were soaked in blood. The silence after the war was worse than the chaos itself. The streets were still, almost unnervingly quiet, as if the world had decided to hold its breath. But in the quiet, the memories surged back, faces of the men he'd killed, the friends he'd betrayed, the families left behind in the wake of his decisions. They had all been nothing but ghosts, once. But now, they were real, lingering in the dark corners of his mind, always watching, never letting him forget. Each body that fell had left behind more than just a pile of flesh and bone. It had left a piece of him behind too. The Yakuza had no place for weakness, no room for regret. You had to keep moving, keep climbing, no matter how many souls you crushed underfoot. And yet, here he was, unable to escape the weight of what he'd done. His hands shook when he tried to close his eyes, the faces of the dead flickering behind his eyelids like twisted shadows. It wasn't supposed to be this way. He had done everything he was told, everything he'd been taught. The code, the loyalty, the honor, it had all seemed so clear when he was younger. But now, standing alone in the darkness of his thoughts, he could see the cracks, the lies, the betrayals, the monsters they had all become. He thought of the men who had once called him brother, now only memories in the wake of his decisions. He could hear their voices, feel their eyes on him, accusing him for the blood that had stained his hands. Was he any different from them? The men who had come before him? The monsters who had built their empires on the backs of the broken? He had once believed that honor was enough, that it would keep him from losing himself. But now, as he walked through the quiet streets, the weight of every life taken, every oath broken, pressed down on him, suffocating him. He tried to drown it out, to silence the ghosts with the hollow rhythm of the clan's demands. But it didn't work. The ghosts were louder now, their whispers piercing the quiet, reminding him of every lie, every death. He had become the thing he had once feared, the monster that lived in the shadows, the one who took without mercy, who destroyed without remorse. And still, the whispers didn't stop. He had built his empire, but at what cost? What was the point of all this power, all this bloodshed, when there was nothing left but silence and regret? He had been so sure, so certain, that this was the way to rise, the way to become something more. But now, standing on the ruins of the life he had built, the question loomed larger than ever. Was it worth it? The ghosts of the fallen wouldn't let him forget. They were always with him now, always reminding him of the price of power. And as he looked out over the city, the weight of his choices settled on him like a heavy shroud, suffocating him, dragging him down into the very shadows he had once embraced. The mission had seemed simple. A man, a target, a calculated move to finish what had begun. But somewhere in the chaos, something had gone wrong. The shot was missed, a misstep, a breath too early, and the silence shattered. Now, he was running, as always, but this time, there was no escape. He didn't understand how it had all unraveled. The plan had been sound, the timing perfect, but the target had slipped away, a shadow in the smoke, and now the only thing left was the echo of his failure. The assassin's bullet, meant for a rival's heart, had instead torn through the wrong life, and the consequences began to pile up like bodies in the street. The violence he had been steeped in, the blood that had long since soaked his soul, seemed to claw at him now, with a force he could no longer control. There were no allies left to turn to, only enemies on all sides. The shadows that had once protected him now felt like chains, dragging him deeper into a world where right and wrong had no place. Every decision he made only led to more bloodshed, more deaths that were all tied to him, each one a reflection of his own inner darkness. He couldn't tell where the Yakuza ended and the man he used to be began. Had he ever been a different person? Or had he always been this, a monster born from a family of monsters, bound by honor but ruled by power? His mind twisted in circles, drowning in a tide of doubt and regret, but there was no stopping now. There was no turning back. The weight of his failure hung like a noose around his neck, and every step he took seemed to tighten it. He'd lost control of the mission, of the family, of himself. The walls he had built to protect him, to shield him from the truth of his existence, were crumbling. He had been running from the inevitable for so long, but now, in the quiet moments between the blood and the violence, the reality had settled in. The man he had become was someone he no longer recognized. He wasn't sure which was worse, the monster he'd become, or the man who had tried to outrun it. The streets felt colder now, the night longer. He had no destination, no plan, only a relentless need to disappear. He couldn't run far enough to escape the past, but the longer he stayed, the more it closed in. The line between right and wrong blurred to nothing, leaving only the shadows, endless and suffocating. Every step he took, every breath he tried to draw, felt like a death sentence. There was no way out of the bloodshed, no way to erase the mistakes, no way to escape the man he had become, and so he ran, not toward freedom, but into the deeper darkness that was his own making, where the shadows swallowed everything, including him. The weight of his actions pressed down on him like a suffocating fog, thickening with every step he took. His mind replayed the faces of those he had hurt, their voices echoing in his ears like a relentless drumbeat. He had lived his life in pursuit of power, of strength, and yet, standing here now, stripped of it all, he realized how little he truly possessed. Redemption seemed like a distant dream, a fragile concept he had abandoned long ago in favor of survival. But survival had come at a cost. He had buried his humanity under layers of blood, dishonor, and betrayal, each one a scar he could no longer ignore. Now, as he wandered through the ruins of his own making, the question lingered. Was it too late to seek redemption, or was he beyond saving, consumed by the thirst for revenge that had ruled him for so long? The temptation of revenge was strong, its allure like a drug he couldn't shake. It whispered to him in quiet moments, urging him to strike back at those who had wronged him. They were the ones who had betrayed him, manipulated him, discarded him when he was no longer useful. They had taken everything from him, leaving him with nothing but the memories of what he had lost. The rage swelled in his chest, hot and fierce, and for a fleeting moment, he felt the old thrill of violence stir within him. But something else gnawed at him, deeper than the desire for vengeance. The faces of the innocent flashed before his eyes, those who had paid the price for his choices. He had made enemies, yes, but in the process, he had lost allies, family, and the very things that had once made him human. Redemption, he realized, wasn't just about seeking forgiveness from others. It was about forgiving himself, something he had never allowed himself to do. The path to redemption was not an easy one. It would mean facing the consequences of his actions, confronting the ghosts he had buried, and accepting the reality that he could never undo the damage he had caused. It would mean letting go of the pride that had driven him to this point, and in its place, finding something that resembled peace. The old wounds would never fully heal, but perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way to stop them from festering. The decision weighed heavily on him. Revenge would be easy. It would give him a momentary sense of satisfaction, a fleeting victory over those who had wronged him. But redemption, the true kind, would require more than bloodshed. It would demand the one thing he had never given: vulnerability. In that moment, standing on the edge of everything he had built, he made his choice: redemption or revenge. The demons of his past would follow him either way, but perhaps, by choosing redemption, he could finally lay them to rest. The reflection staring back at him was not the man he had once hoped to be. The face was older now, marked with the lines of regret and the hollowing weight of years spent in shadows. He hadn't realized how far he had fallen until this very moment. It wasn't the scar running across his cheek or the hardness in his eyes that struck him the most, but the emptiness within. He had become a mirror of the Yakuza's spirit, ruthless, driven by an unyielding code of honor that stripped him of his humanity. He reached up and touched the cool glass, his fingers tracing the sharp angles of his face, as though searching for the man who had once been full of dreams. But all that remained was the reflection of a man who had buried his soul under layers of violence, who had traded every ounce of integrity for power, respect, and survival. Each choice he made had led him here, to this place of quiet despair. The Yakuza had molded him, shaped him into this demon he now saw part man, part monster, all honor-bound. The image in the mirror didn't feel like his own anymore. He was no longer the boy who had once carried the weight of loyalty on his shoulders, proud of his bloodline, the faces of the men he had killed, the families he had betrayed. All of them swirled around him now, haunting his every thought. They had once been part of his world, part of his life, but now they were just ghosts, reminding him of how far he had fallen. He had become the very thing he had once feared, the embodiment of the darkness he had allowed to consume him. Yet, there was no denying the truth. His reflection told a story he couldn't escape. He had lived for honor, for a code that had long ceased to be about duty and had become a justification for cruelty. He had killed, manipulated, and broken promises to climb the ladder of power, each step costing him more of himself. The Yakuza had shaped him into a figure who stood tall in the world of shadows, but who stood alone. For a long moment, he stared into the mirror, searching for something, anything, that could redeem him. But there was no forgiveness in the glass, only the cold, hard truth of the man he had become. There was no escaping the Yakuza's grip. It had twisted him into a creature who could no longer separate honor from brutality. He dropped his hand, letting it fall to his side. The reflection would always be there, a reminder that the demon he had become was not a separate entity, but a part of him, born from the choices he had made. And now, as he stood before the mirror, he understood the true cost of his path, the soul he had sacrificed to honor. The night was heavy with smoke and secrecy as the protagonist sat at a dimly lit table, staring at a man who was anything but ordinary. His skin was pale, tattoos slithering down his arms like snakes, his eyes cold and calculating. The air between them was thick with tension, a mix of respect and dread. They were about to seal a deal that no one would ever dare to speak of in the light of day. The world of the Yakuza was no longer enough. The grip of his family, once so firm, was slipping. Rival families had made their moves, and with each passing day, the protagonist's power was eroded, bit by bit. He had seen men who were once loyal bow to the pressure of greed and ambition. His own soldiers had been seduced by promises from the outside world, promises of wealth, of safety. He had no choice but to look beyond Japan for the strength to rebuild what was his. The man across from him, a high-ranking figure from a notorious Chinese triad, held the power to do what the Yakuza could not: bring in resources, manpower, influence beyond the borders. They spoke little, the silence between them more telling than any words could be. The deal was set. Weapons, money, even drugs, all funneled through networks too vast for even the most experienced Yakuza eyes to track. The protagonist knew the risks. Alliances with foreign crime syndicates were always dangerous. Betrayal ran deep in their veins, and loyalty was a currency only the foolish trusted. But in this world, survival often outweighed honor. He had no choice but to follow the path that led him further into darkness, further away from the man he once was. His father's teachings, once so clear, now felt like distant echoes in his mind. Power, control, it was all slipping through his fingers like water, and with it, the very soul of the Yakuza. The agreement was made, a handshake sealed with the knowledge that this union would bring blood. He would be forced to pay the price for this power, but it was a price he was willing to pay. He had crossed a line so dark it could never be undone. The alliances he now made were unholy, tainted by corruption and greed. There would be no turning back. His loyalty was no longer solely to the Yakuza family. It was to the world of crime itself, a world that would swallow him whole if he wasn't careful. The Chinese triad leader stood and left without a word, as if nothing had changed. But the protagonist knew better. The consequences of this deal would stain his soul forever, and soon enough, the Yakuza would become a puppet of forces greater than himself. This was no longer just a battle for power. It was a war for survival in a world where honor had become a relic of the past. As the door clicked shut, the protagonist leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. This was the price of reclaiming power, and he knew it. The question was no longer whether he could live with these choices. It was whether he could survive the storm they would inevitably bring. The night air was thick with a humid stillness, heavy with the weight of a decision that could shatter everything he had built. The protagonist stood at the edge of his small office, looking out over the city, his mind torn between two paths. The Yakuza had been his life, his bloodline, his everything. But now, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, he felt a weight on his shoulders that threatened to crush him. His enemies, both within and beyond the Yakuza, were closing in. The alliance with foreign syndicates had bought him time, but it had also made him more dangerous and more vulnerable. His closest allies, his most trusted men, had begun to turn their eyes away, sensing the growing instability of his rule. His father's teachings rang in his ears, a constant reminder that there was no true escape from the world they had lived in. But now, that same world felt like a cage. He could feel the bitter taste of betrayal seeping into every corner of his life. Men he had once called brothers had fallen under the sway of rival families, hungry for power, hungry for control. Every move, every deal, was now a game of survival, not honor. His choices had become his enemies, closing in on him from every angle. The very blood that once bound the Yakuza together had turned to poison, and it was only a matter of time before it consumed him whole. But as he stared out at the city, a flicker of something new began to grow inside him, a desire for freedom, for peace. He had built an empire on fear, but he had also lost himself in the process. There were moments now, fleeting but real, when he wondered if he could leave it all behind. The money, the power, the violence, the lives he had taken, the promises he had broken. What if he could disappear into the night, fade into the shadows, and leave behind the legacy of blood? What if he could start anew, build a life outside of this endless cycle of destruction? But as the thought settled in, a cold, bitter reality gripped him. The Yakuza was not just a life, it was a prison with no walls, no bars, just a constant pull toward the center. His choices were not his own. If he left, they would come for him. The men he had crossed, the families he had wronged, would not let him walk away. He would be hunted, marked for death. And yet, staying would mean war. It would mean shedding more blood, losing more pieces of his soul. He turned away from the window, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no easy choice here, no right answer. There was only the crossroads, only the knowledge that whatever path he took would define the rest of his life. And maybe, just maybe, it would decide whether he lived or died. The storm that had been building for weeks finally broke in the quiet of the night. The protagonist sat at his desk, the weight of endless decisions pressing down on him. He had just returned from a meeting with his most trusted lieutenants, the men who had been with him since the beginning. But tonight, something was different. There was a coldness in the air, a tension that hadn't been there before. It was a heaviness, a feeling he couldn't shake, gnawing at the edges of his mind. The phone rang, slicing through the silence, its sound almost too sharp. He picked it up without thinking, his eyes never leaving the paperwork that lay before him. But the voice on the other end wasn't one he recognized, the words simple but jarring. He's been feeding information to the enemy. For a moment, everything stopped. The room seemed to tilt, as if the ground beneath him had shifted. He had always known that trust was a fragile thing in the Yakuza, that loyalty was a currency that could be bought and sold. But this was different. The name that followed the man who had been a brother, a mentor, a friend, struck him like a knife to the gut. He had always believed that betrayal could never come from within the family. The code, the honor, it was supposed to protect them from that. But here it was, the very thing that had held them all together now shattered, splintering into 1,000 pieces. He stood up, the room spinning around him. His hands shook, not from fear, but from disbelief. How could it be him? The man who had sworn allegiance, the one who had shared his blood, his life, his darkest secrets. How could the very foundation of their family crumble beneath the weight of one person's treachery? The truth sank in, like poison, bitter and cold. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was a blow to everything he had ever believed in. The Yakuza code, the honor, the loyalty, they were lies, just as fragile as the people who lived by them. He didn't know how long he stood there, lost in his thoughts, his mind racing to make sense of it all. But when he finally looked up, he knew what had to be done. The traitor had to be dealt with, but the damage was already done. The trust had been broken, and with it, the last vestiges of his faith in the family. He walked to the window, his reflection staring back at him. The man who once believed in loyalty, who had built an empire on the strength of his family, now saw a stranger in the glass, a man who had been betrayed by the very thing he had sworn to protect. The storm had passed. But the damage was far from over. The family was broken, and there was no turning back. The operation had seemed simple enough, a clean hit, quick, in and out. The plan was tight, the targets well placed, and the crew experienced. But as the night unfolded, the sharp edge of his expectations dulled, slipping into the chaos of the unknown. What was supposed to be a routine mission spiraled out of control in a matter of seconds. The sounds of gunfire, the shouts in the dark, the crackle of static in his earpiece all became a blur. The moment he realized something was wrong, it was too late. The enemy had anticipated their move, setting up an ambush that trapped them in the heart of the city. The streets, once familiar and safe, now felt alien, as if the very concrete beneath their feet had turned against them. His thoughts raced, trying to salvage the mission. But the world outside had already shifted. It was his fault. He hadn't seen it coming. There had been signs, small, easily ignored signs, and he had let his arrogance blind him. Then, the worst happened. He heard the unmistakable sound of a body hitting the ground, the sharp exhale of breath followed by the heavy thud. He spun around to find one of his own men, his closest ally, crumpled in the street. Blood pooled around him, a scarlet river staining the pavement. The man had been with him from the start, loyal, strong, fearless. Now, he was nothing more than a memory, his life snatched away in the blink of an eye. The weight of it hit him harder than any bullet ever could. He could feel the tightness in his chest, the sting of failure cutting deeper than the loss itself. The cost of this life, the Yakuza's brutal, unforgiving world, he had always known it was steeped in blood, but now, the reality of it crushed him. He had failed not just in the mission, but in protecting the people who had followed him and trusted him. The hours that followed were a blur of violence and retreat. They barely made it out alive, the blood on his hands mixing with his own sweat, his mind clouded with the consequences. But it was the empty space beside him, the one once filled with his friend, that haunted him. It was his fault. He had sent him into the fire, never imagining the heat would burn so hot, so fast. By the time they reached their hideout, the adrenaline had faded, leaving only the cold, hollow aftermath. His mind reeled, the image of his fallen ally forever etched in his mind. The weight of his actions, of this life he had chosen, settled into his bones. It was a price too high. He could feel the unraveling inside him, a slow erosion of the man he had once been, the Yakuza code, his honor. The loyalty that had guided him, all of it now felt distant, like a fading dream. In its place, there was only the crushing weight of regret and the knowledge that there was no turning back. The walls closed in faster than he could anticipate. What had once been his empire, a world where he commanded respect, power, and fear, was now crumbling around him. The whispers had started slow, like a storm building on the horizon, but now they roared, deafening. His actions, his choices had come back to haunt him. The very people who had once pledged their loyalty to him were now the ones hunting him. The very hands that once held his back were now sharpening their knives, ready to bring him down. He'd known it was coming, but knowing it didn't make the reality any easier to bear. The Yakuza, the family he'd fought for, bled for, had turned their backs on him. His decisions, his failures, had made him a liability. In their eyes, he was no longer a brother. He was a threat. The same code that had once upheld him was now a noose tightening around his neck. There were no safe places left. Every corner, every alley, every shadow seemed to be filled with eyes. He'd trusted them, trusted the family, but now they were all too eager to see him fall. His former allies, the ones he once called brothers, were now his enemies. The fear he once inspired now belonged to him, a bitter taste in his mouth, a feeling that gnawed at him with every step. As the days passed, his options dwindled. The streets he once ruled felt foreign now, the neon lights flickering like distant stars. He was no longer in control of his destiny. His every move was calculated, a game of survival, and he knew that even the smallest mistake would be his last. His former men had become strangers. His phone buzzed with calls he no longer answered. His contacts had gone quiet, his network of influence crumbling, one name at a time. The money, the power, none of it mattered now. He wasn't a king anymore. He was a ghost, running from the inevitable, trying to outrun the consequences of a life built on blood and betrayal. Night after night, he stayed on the move, never in one place for too long. His bodyguards, once his brothers in arms, had disappeared into the night, replaced by shadows he couldn't trust. He no longer slept, never allowing himself to rest for fear of the enemy's next move. And as the days wore on, it became clear there would be no redemption, no safe haven, no final act of grace. Only the cold, harsh truth that he had fallen. The Yakuza, his family, had turned on him, and now there was no way back. He had no one left. His rise to power had been swift, but his fall from grace was even faster, and he had no choice but to face the consequences of a life lived in the shadows. He was a hunted man now, and no amount of honor would bring him peace. The night was alive with tension, thick and suffocating in the humid air. The streets of the city pulsed with a rhythm of violence that echoed in every shadow, every alley. It was the sound of inevitable destruction, a storm that had been brewing for far too long. His empire, once invincible, was crumbling, and the Yakuza families he had fought to protect were now poised to tear each other apart. He stood on a rooftop, watching the flickering lights below, feeling the weight of what was coming. The streets would run red tonight. The deal he had tried to broker, the fragile peace he had hoped would hold, was already slipping through his fingers. The rival families were closing in, their men scattered like wolves across the city, waiting for the signal to strike. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that the flames of war were about to be ignited. It was happening. It had been years since a battle like this had taken place, years since honor and blood were so deeply intertwined. Now, the Yakuza was no longer a brotherhood. It was a battlefield. Gunfire erupted in the distance, breaking the silence with its sharp cracks. The first shots had been fired, and soon it would be chaos. He could see it unfolding below, bodies moving like shadows through the streets, the unmistakable figures of men he once called allies. His brothers were now fighting against him, fighting for control of a world he had helped build, and yet he was powerless to stop it. Flashes of light lit up the night, the fiery glow of explosions casting an eerie hue over the city. The sounds of screams, the roar of gunfire, the deafening blasts, they all seemed to fade into a single, overwhelming wave of destruction. It was his life burning, his world being reduced to rubble. Everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed, was now nothing more than a pile of ash. The streets were no longer his. The Yakuza was no longer his. The ghosts of the fallen were everywhere, their spirits rising from the bloodied streets like specters of vengeance. He moved down from the rooftop, his footsteps heavy with the weight of his choices. Every step he took, every corner he turned, was another reminder of how far he had fallen. The city that had once been his kingdom was now a battlefield, and he was caught in the heart of it, unable to save it. His family, his brothers, were fighting, dying, all for something he could no longer control. The fires grew brighter, and the smell of burning flesh and gunpowder filled the air. It was the end. The empire was gone, and he had no one left. The Yakuza was no longer a brotherhood bound by loyalty and honor. It was a war zone, and he was watching it all burn to the ground. The city was nothing but a distant memory now, its lights and the sound of its dying screams fading into the shadows of his mind. The protagonist moved through the countryside, his footsteps silent against the cold earth. the weight of his past pressing down on him like an unbearable burden. The ghosts of those he had wronged, those he had betrayed, followed him. Their whispers clawed at his soul, tormenting him, reminding him of every life he had taken, every promise he had broken. They were the ones who had guided him this far toward the path of redemption he wasn't sure he deserved. Japan's mountains stretched ahead, their peaks hidden by mist, ancient and untouched, the world unchanged for centuries. It was here that he sought solace, here that he hoped to find peace, though the notion felt foreign. The journey was a desperate one, though he had no clear destination. His mind was filled with memories of his former life, flashes of brutality, fleeting moments of loyalty, bloodshed, and deceit. He had been a demon, a beast in human form, and now he wondered if there was anything left of the man he had once been. He had heard stories of people seeking redemption in the remote corners of Japan, men and women who had wandered through the wilderness, trying to atone for their sins. He wasn't sure he believed in redemption anymore, but something inside him clung to the idea. Maybe it was the faintest hope that he could wash the blood from his hands, erase the years of violence, and find some peace before the inevitable end came for him. The path was harsh, the mountains unforgiving, but he pressed on. Each step was a reminder of the life he had left behind, each mile a step further away from the chaos he had once thrived in. He passed villages where old women stared at him, their eyes filled with suspicion, as if they could sense the darkness in his heart. No one spoke to him, no one offered him solace. He was a ghost among them, a figure who did not belong. At night, he slept beneath the stars, his thoughts consumed by the faces of the men and women who had died because of him. He remembered the cold, calculating decisions that had led to their deaths, the lies he had told to protect himself, and the dishonor he had brought to his family. How many had he betrayed? How many had he killed? There were no answers in the quiet of the night, no voices to give him guidance. He was alone, and the realization was as heavy as 1,000 bricks pressing against his chest. He had severed all ties with the world he once knew, and now he wandered in the footsteps of ghosts, hoping for a redemption that seemed as distant as the mountains themselves. Yet he couldn't turn back, not now. The journey was the only thing left, and with it, perhaps a chance to finally silence the demons that had haunted him for so long. The silence of the mountains was suffocating, pressing in on him from all sides. It was here, in the solitude, that his thoughts became both his greatest torment and his only companion. The path he had chosen to walk was not just physical, it was mental, a labyrinth of guilt and regret that twisted around him tighter with each passing day. His body moved forward mechanically, but inside, he was at war with himself. The weight of his past, the countless lives he had taken, the betrayals he had made, all swirled around him in a never-ending storm. He had once been a man of action, a figure who embodied the very essence of the Yakuza's code. Loyalty, honor, power, those were the pillars that had held him up. But now, with nothing but the wilderness stretching before him, and nothing but his memories behind him, he wondered what those words truly meant. Honor? Was it merely a weapon used to justify the actions he had taken? Was loyalty just a guise to manipulate and control? He had followed the code, but it had led him to this isolated, broken, and haunted by the ghosts of his past. He knelt by a stream, his fingers tracing the water's surface, watching the ripples distort the reflection of the sky above. The stillness of the moment did nothing to calm the turmoil within him. His mind flickered back to the choices he had made, the people he had destroyed along the way. He had always believed that he was in control, that his honor was untouchable. But now, standing in the cold embrace of nature, he felt the fragility of it all. What was honor when it had cost him everything? He closed his eyes, memories flooding back the bloody faces of those he had betrayed, the scream of a dying man who had trusted him, the cold, empty eyes of his mentor when he had let him down. These were the things that lived with him now, the price of the life he had chosen. He had been taught to embrace violence, to live in a world where strength ruled above all else. But now, in the stillness of the mountains, he realized that strength had always been a lie. The real strength lay in the ability to confront one's own darkness, to live with the choices that had been made. The struggle within him was no longer about survival or power. It was about redemption, about finding a way to become something more than the monster he had been. Could he still salvage what little humanity remained within him, or had he destroyed it all in the name of honor? His hands trembled as he stood, the weight of his past pressing down on him. The mountains seemed to mock him, their immensity reminding him of how small and insignificant he had become. The demons inside him would not be silenced so easily. They would continue to claw at him, pushing him to the brink, until he faced the truth of who he had truly become. Only then could he understand what honor truly meant, and whether he could ever find peace with himself. The world he had once ruled, the empire he had built with blood and sweat, no longer existed in the way he remembered. From his secluded place in the shadows, he could see the signs, the whispers in the streets, the new faces in the city, the rising strength of the new Yakuza leader who had emerged in his absence. It was a bitter pill to swallow, one he could hardly bring himself to admit. His reign, so firmly rooted in the past, was being eclipsed by a new breed of Yakuza, one that had learned from his mistakes and adapted to the changing times. He watched from the distance as this new leader, younger, sharper, more ruthless, carved out territory that had once belonged to him. The man was everything he had been in his youth, ambitious, hungry for power, and willing to do whatever it took to get to the top. But where the protagonist had once used loyalty and fear to maintain control, this new leader used strategy, alliances, and a cold, calculated approach. The old ways no longer worked. The streets were changing, and so were the rules. As much as he tried to ignore it, the truth was inescapable. His time had passed. The Yakuza had moved on, and with it, so had the power he once wielded. The city had grown used to a new order, one that did not include him. He had been a king, but now he was nothing more than a ghost, an echo of a time that no longer seemed relevant. His own people, the ones he had bled for, the ones who had once sworn their loyalty to him, now looked to the new demon rising from the ashes. There was a part of him that wanted to fight, to reclaim what he had lost, but another part of him, the part that had seen too much bloodshed and betrayal, knew that it was over. The game had changed, and he was no longer the player. His body, worn and tired from years of war and power, could no longer withstand the battle he had once fought with ease. His hands trembled as he lit a cigarette, the smoke rising into the night air, and for a brief moment he wondered if he had ever truly been in control, or if he had only been a pawn in a game far larger than himself. In the end, he was left with nothing but the cold truth that the world had moved on. A new demon had risen, and it was not him. It was someone else's time to shine, someone else's blood to spill, someone else's empire to build. And as he stood there, watching the city continue to turn without him, he realized that perhaps it had always been this way. Power was fleeting. Today's king was tomorrow's shadow, and all he could do now was fade into it. The phone call had come in the dead of night, the voice on the other end cold, detached, and final. His father, the man who had molded him, who had shaped him into the ruthless figure he had become, was dead. A bullet to the head, swift and without mercy. A fitting end for a man whose life had been steeped in violence and deception. But as the words sank in, the protagonist felt an emptiness that he hadn't anticipated. He had always known that his father's time would come, that the weight of his actions would eventually catch up with him. Still, nothing could prepare him for the hollow ache that followed. The old man's death signaled the end of an era, the collapse of the family legacy that had once been untouchable. His father had been a towering figure, a man who had commanded respect not only within the Yakuza but across the criminal underworld. He had built the empire that the protagonist was now supposed to carry on, but now it was in ruins, torn apart by internal strife, betrayal, and power struggles. The protagonist found himself standing at the edge of a precipice, his father's death a cruel reminder of the inevitable fate that awaited all men of honor. The Yakuza was no longer the family it had once been. It was a shadow of its former self. Honor, something that had always been the foundation of his existence, now felt like an anchor, dragging him deeper into the abyss. It was a code that had been drilled into him from an early age, a code that dictated every action, every decision, and every relationship. Yet, now, it seemed like a cruel joke. What had honor ever given him? A legacy built on bloodshed, a life filled with betrayal, and now the death of his father, the very man who had taught him what honor meant. The code had failed them both, leaving nothing but a broken family and a legacy shattered beyond repair. He stood in front of the mirror, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow with the weight of it all. The man he saw staring back at him was a far cry from the ambitious young man who had once dreamed of rising to the top of the Yakuza, of becoming a legend like his father. Now, all that was left was a man lost in the ruins of his own life, trying to piece together what was left of a world that no longer made sense. The pain of his father's death was one thing, but the realization that the very code he had sworn his life to had led him to this moment was almost too much to bear. Honor had promised him everything, but in the end, it had only taken. The weight of it crushed him, and for the first time in his life, he questioned whether the life he had chosen had been worth it at all. The silence was suffocating. The once bustling streets of the underworld were eerily quiet now. The hum of power and fear that had defined his life faded into a deep, unsettling stillness. He walked through the empty streets, each step echoing like a ghost's warning. The Yakuza families that had once ruled with iron fists, their influence stretching across cities and countries, were no more. The battles, the betrayals, the bloodshed, it all seemed like a distant memory, fading as quickly as the smoke of a dying fire. The empire he had once been a part of was gone, shattered by the very forces that had once held it together. The power had slipped away like sand through his fingers, leaving him with nothing but the emptiness that came after everything he had known had been destroyed. He had no home now, no family, no honor. What was left of his life? Once, he had been a rising star, his every move calculated, each decision pushing him closer to the top. Now, the pinnacle he had fought so hard to reach was nothing but ruins, a testament to the futility of it all. The world had moved on, and he was left behind, a relic of a time long past. He tried to fill the silence, but the only thing he heard was the echo of his own breath. Without the Yakuza, without the weight of the code that had bound him, he was adrift, uncertain of who he was now. Was he still the man who had once led, the man who had been feared and respected? Or had he become something else entirely, a shadow of his former self, a man without a purpose, lost in the aftermath of his choices? Every step he took seemed to pull him further away from the man he had once been. There were no more battles to fight, no more enemies to conquer. The streets were silent, and in that silence, he was forced to confront the one thing he had always avoided himself. He knew the world didn't care about him, didn't care about his past or the legacy he had tried to build. No one would mourn the fall of the Yakuza. The world had forgotten the bloodshed, the sacrifices, the honor that had once bound them all together. Now, he was just another lost soul, trying to find a place in a world that had moved on without him. The silence pressed down on him, suffocating him from all sides. It was a silence that had been earned through years of violence, lies, and deceit. And now, In its wake, there was only the void, a void that no amount of power, no amount of wealth could ever fill. He had been a part of something great, something feared. But now, with it all gone, he had to figure out what came next. What purpose did he have left in a world that no longer cared? The silence lingered, and he knew the answer would not come easily. The silence that had once consumed him was now replaced with a single, burning desire. Vengeance. It was the only thing that made sense in the aftermath of everything he had lost. He had walked away from the wreckage of his past, tried to find some semblance of peace, but there was no peace to be found. The Yakuza had been more than just a family, more than an empire. It had been his life, his everything. And those who had destroyed it, those who had stripped him of his purpose, would pay. He knew what he had to do. No more wandering through empty streets, no more reflections in broken mirrors. He had to go after the ones who had orchestrated his downfall, the ones who had stolen everything from him. He'd trusted them once, called them allies, but now they were the enemy. Every face he had known, every handshake that had once meant something, was now a target. The path was clear, even if it meant walking through hell itself. He'd been through too much to let them get away with it. The betrayal had cut deep, and it was time to make them feel the same pain, the same loss. He started to plan, methodical and cold, each move calculated with the precision he had once used to climb to the top. Every man, every woman, every soldier who had played a part in his fall would be hunted down, one by one. The plan was simple: find them, make them suffer, and leave nothing but ashes behind. He moved like a shadow, slipping through the cracks of a world that had once belonged to him. There were no alliances now, no codes to follow, only blood. He had already lost everything, and now he would lose even more. His soul, already hollowed out by the years of violence and betrayal, would be the price. He no longer cared. Vengeance was the only thing that mattered. As he tracked down his enemies, the faces of those he had loved and lost flashed in his mind. The people who had trusted him, who had stood by his side, now ghosts that would never be at peace. He had been a monster then, a man driven by power, and now he was a demon driven by revenge. He had crossed every line he had once sworn to honor, and now there was no going back. Each kill brought a fleeting satisfaction, a temporary quiet, but it was never enough. The fire inside him burned brighter with every life he took, but it could never be extinguished. His body and soul ached with the weight of the choices he had made, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered except seeing them fall, just as he had. Every step closer to his enemies was another step further from the man he used to be, but he didn't care anymore. He had lost his way long ago, and vengeance was the only road left to walk. The feeling was subtle at first, a shift in the air that he couldn't quite put his finger on, but soon it was undeniable something was wrong. As he sat alone in his safe house, the city lights flickering outside, a thought gnawed at the back of his mind. It wasn't the enemies he'd been hunting or the lives he'd been taking that were the problem anymore. No, it was something much closer, something buried in the shadows of his own family. The truth revealed itself like a whisper at first. Small inconsistencies, a shift in how people moved around him, a hesitation in their eyes when they thought he wasn't looking. He had trained himself to notice these things, small signs that meant everything. He'd learned long ago that trust was a currency in the world of the Yakuza, one that could be spent, stolen, or lost without warning, and now it was slipping from his fingers. The betrayal didn't come from an outsider. It came from within, from someone he had called a brother, a confidant. He had known this man for years, shared blood and secrets. They had fought together, laughed together, built their empire on the same foundation. And yet, now, the very man who had stood by him through everything had turned the game against him. The signs were there, too clear to ignore. His ally, once loyal, was now feeding information to their enemies, working with rival clans, feeding them the exact plans he had once trusted him with. It was as if every moment of shared history, every word of trust, had been a carefully calculated lie. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife. It wasn't just business. This was personal. This was a man who had once sworn loyalty, now playing the role of a puppet master, pulling strings behind his back. With every betrayal, a part of him died. The code he had lived by, the honor he had once cherished, was being chipped away piece by piece. Now, it was clear that the world he had once believed in had crumbled. There was no honor in the Yakuza anymore, no respect. The bloodshed had been nothing but a game for those who wanted power, and he had been too blind to see it. His mind raced, his thoughts clouded with rage and disbelief. He wanted to kill him, to end this treachery in the way he had been trained, but something held him back. This was no longer just about survival or revenge. This was about the last vestige of his humanity, the last thread of the man he used to be. But he knew he had no choice. He reached for the phone, his hand trembling as he dialed the number of the one man who could change everything. He had no time for hesitation. The betrayal was already set into motion, and it was up to him to stop it before it consumed everything he had left. The air was thick with tension as he stood in the heart of the abandoned warehouse, the sounds of distant sirens drifting like ghosts through the cracked windows. The cold metal floor beneath him reflected the harsh fluorescent lights above, casting long shadows across the room. Every breath he took seemed to grow heavier, like the weight of the past was pressing down on him, suffocating him with the memories of everything he had lost. His former best friend stood across from him, just as cold, just as calculated, but with something darker in his eyes. It was a look he had never seen before, a look that told him everything had changed. This wasn't just a battle for dominance, for the control of the Yakuza. This was personal. They had once fought side by side, sharing victories and defeats, trusting each other with their lives. They had been brothers in blood, bound by loyalty and honor. But somewhere along the way, that bond had been shattered. What once had been camaraderie had turned to envy, and what had been mutual respect had become bitter rivalry. Now, standing in this cold, empty warehouse, they were no longer friends. They were enemies. "You should have known it would come to this," his former friend said, his voice low, dripping with venom. The man stepped forward, his hand reaching for the gun holstered at his side. "You were always too weak, too sentimental. This world doesn't have room for people like you anymore." The words stung, but there was no time for reflection. His hand was already on his own weapon, fingers gripping the cold steel as his heart pounded against his chest. This was it. The moment had arrived, the inevitable clash between two men who had once been brothers but were now destined to destroy each other. The first shot rang out, echoing through the warehouse, followed by a sharp pain in his shoulder. Blood began to seep through his shirt, but he didn't flinch. He was already moving, rolling to the side, using the old crates for cover. He could hear his friend's footsteps approaching, a rhythm he had memorized from years of training. But there was no time to think about strategy now. His survival was the only thing that mattered. Bullets flew, tearing through the air with a deadly precision. He fired back, his shot grazing his friend's leg, sending him stumbling back. But it wasn't enough to stop him. They were locked in a deadly dance, each step bringing them closer to the final conclusion. The final blow came swiftly, painfully. He didn't know if it was the pain in his chest or the exhaustion from years of betrayal that drove him to his knees. But he knew one thing: this fight would be his last. As the darkness crept in, he saw his friend standing over him, gun raised high, but there was no victory in his eyes, only emptiness. In that moment, he realized there was no winner in this world, just survival. The weight of betrayal hung heavily in the air, thickening every breath he took. It had been a slow unraveling, one that started with whispers in the dark, the faintest hints that something was wrong. But now, standing in front of the man he once considered his closest ally, it was undeniable. The truth had finally arrived like a cold blade to the heart. "You're a fool," his ally said, voice steady, almost detached. The words felt like shards of glass, each one cutting deeper than the last. He stared at the man, searching for some semblance of remorse, some trace of the bond they once shared. But there was nothing, just cold indifference. "How could you?" he whispered, his own voice betraying the shock that rattled him to his core. This was supposed to be the man who had stood by him through it all, the one who had fought at his side, who knew the weight of every decision they had made. But now, that history was nothing more than a lie. His ally's eyes, once familiar, now felt foreign, as though the man standing in front of him was nothing but a stranger wearing his face. The rules of the Yakuza, honor, loyalty, duty, were etched into their very souls. They had lived and breathed those values, had given everything for them. But here, in this moment, those rules were meaningless. The foundation they had built their lives on was now a shattered ruin at their feet. "You should have known better," his ally continued, the edge of contempt clear in his voice. "You think you can play by the old rules in a world that's changing. The Yakuza's code is dead. It's a relic, and I'm just doing what I need to do to survive." The words hit harder than any blow he had ever taken. The code that had guided him through every decision, every sacrifice, was now nothing more than a joke. The truth burned as the pieces of his life, his very identity, began to crumble around him. His fists clenched, but the anger didn't come, not like it used to. Instead, there was only a hollow emptiness, a chasm where the conviction he had once felt had been ripped away. The Yakuza code was broken, and with it, everything he had ever stood for. He took a step back, his mind racing, trying to find something to hold on to. But there was nothing, not anymore. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. It wasn't directed at his betrayer, but at the air around them. The world had changed, and there was no going back. The rules were gone, the foundation shattered. He was lost in a world without honor. "You survive," his ally said, a cold smile curling at the corners of his lips. "Or you die." The offer came like a whisper in the night, barely audible yet unmistakably clear. Escape. A way out of the world he had once ruled. A way to sever the ties that bound him to the Yakuza. But as the words echoed in his ears, he felt the weight of their implications settle heavily in his chest. It wasn't the first time he had thought about running, about disappearing into the shadows and leaving behind the bloodstains, the betrayals, the endless cycle of violence. The thought had crossed his mind countless times, a fleeting fantasy that always faded as quickly as it appeared. But this time, it was real. The opportunity was before him, offered by someone who, for reasons unknown, believed he still had something worth saving. "Take it," the voice urged, low and insistent. "You don't have to stay here. You don't have to die in this life. You can disappear. You can live." He stared into the darkness, the flickering light of a distant lantern casting long shadows across the room. His fingers, stiff from years of gripping weapons and making decisions that weighed lives, flexed involuntarily as he thought about what it would mean to walk away. To walk away from the Yakuza, the family he had been born into, the family that had shaped every part of him, for better or worse. But what would be left if he left it all behind? The streets he once ruled with fear and respect would quickly forget him. The men he had called brothers would soon find new leaders to follow, and the world would continue without him. He would be no more than a ghost, a faded memory in a city that had moved on. And what of the ones he loved? The faces of those he had fought for, those he had failed to protect, flashed before his eyes. His family, his allies, his children, what would happen to them if he abandoned them? Would they be left to face the consequences of his actions, alone in a world that showed no mercy? He had already caused enough pain. Was he willing to leave them with even more? The choice gnawed at him, tearing at the fragile threads of his soul. There was no easy answer. There was only the promise of peace on one side, and the certainty of death on the other. But peace meant surrender. It meant turning his back on everything he had ever fought for, everything he had ever believed in. He closed his eyes, the weight of his decision sinking deeper with every passing second. The world outside would go on without him, and so would his family. But he had been shaped by this world, for better or worse. To leave it now would be to deny everything he had ever known, everything he had ever been. So, he chose the only path he knew. He stayed. He would face whatever came next, even if it meant saying goodbye to everything he once held dear. The long goodbye had already begun. There was a man who saw it all, and yet remained unseen. He was the quiet figure in the corner of every meeting, the shadow that hovered on the edges of every confrontation. He was neither a soldier nor a leader, but a witness. His name was seldom spoken, but his presence was always felt. In the world of the Yakuza, he was a part of everything and nothing at once. He watched the men he knew as brothers rise and fall, their ambitions leading them down paths of blood and fire. He watched as the young ones, eager and hungry for power, made deals that would cost them their souls. The older men, who had seen it all before, moved with the certainty of experience, their eyes hardened by the years of war and betrayal. But it was the eyes of the quiet man that saw the truth that others missed. In a world driven by loyalty and vengeance, he knew the cost of each word spoken, each oath sworn. He had seen men give their lives for promises made in the dead of night, and he had seen those same promises broken when the dawn arrived. Loyalty was the currency of the Yakuza, but it was never enough to stop a bullet, never enough to save a life once the tide of betrayal had begun to rise. He had witnessed love too, though it was a rare and fragile thing. In the underworld, love was a liability. It could be used as a weapon or a weakness, depending on whose hands it rested in. He had seen men torn apart by the women they loved, their hearts shattered when those same women betrayed them. He had seen families torn asunder by greed and power, and children left to grow up in the ashes of lives they could never understand. And vengeance was the thread that ran through everything. It was the force that moved the hands of kings and criminals alike, pushing them toward destruction. The quiet man had seen countless acts of revenge, some swift and brutal, others slow and agonizing. But in the end, he knew that revenge never filled the emptiness inside. It only dug the hole deeper. He had seen enough to know that there was no escaping the cycle, no way to break free once you had entered the world of the Yakuza. Every decision, every action, came with a price, and that price was always paid in blood. The quiet man had never been a part of the bloodshed, but he had never been free of it either. The Yakuza world, with all its violence, honor, and betrayal, was a mirror to his own soul. And though he never raised a hand in anger, his silence spoke louder than words ever could. For in his silence, he had witnessed it all, and in witnessing, he had become part of it, forever bound by the cost of loyalty, love, and vengeance. The city seemed quieter now, as if the very air around him had softened, the chaos of his past finally fading into distant echoes. The protagonist stood at the edge of his new life, uncertain yet determined. A life without the shadow of the Yakuza looming over him, a life where he could breathe without the constant weight of violence pressing down on his chest. The streets were unfamiliar, peaceful in a way that felt almost unreal. He had left it all behind, the blood, the oaths, the endless battles. He had promised himself that this would be the rebirth he needed, a chance to start fresh. But peace, like everything in his world, was fragile. It wasn't long before the first reminder of his old life made itself known. The quiet hum of the city streets was pierced by a passing car, its engine a familiar sound that made his skin crawl. The car didn't stop. It never did. But in the brief flash of headlights, in the way the vehicle lingered, he felt the all-too-familiar gaze of a past he couldn't outrun. At first, he tried to ignore it. He convinced himself that the ghosts of his old life would leave him be, that he could carve out a new existence free from the shadows of the Yakuza. He threw himself into the work, the small things that now made up his days, getting to know new faces, learning the rhythm of a life untouched by the bloodshed. He was careful, deliberate, no risks, no memories. But old enemies are patient, and they follow, even in silence. The rumors were always there, lurking beneath the surface of every conversation, the whispers he couldn't ignore. A friend of a friend had seen him, the name he thought forgotten back in the dark corners of the city. Another reminder that the Yakuza doesn't forget, not even for a moment. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every passing stranger, every unexpected sound, made him tense, his hand hovering over the small gun hidden beneath his jacket. It wasn't paranoia. It was survival. The rules of the world he had lived in were written in blood, and those rules never truly let you go. He could move across the world, change his name, find a quiet corner to hide in. But the Yakuza was a part of him, a stain he couldn't scrub off. One evening, as he walked through the alleyway outside his small apartment, he caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows, a figure just beyond the reach of the dim streetlights. He knew instantly. They knew he was here. His heart pounded, his body frozen in the same instinctual response that had kept him alive for years. He wasn't free. Not yet. The past had a way of catching up, of finding you, no matter how far you ran. The ghost of his former life stood before him, the long-dead Yakuza family watching, waiting, and he realized with bitter clarity that there was no rebirth in shadows. There was only survival, and survival meant facing what you had left behind. The weight of honor was suffocating. For years, it had been his guiding star, the invisible thread that connected him to everything he had ever known. Loyalty, respect, the code he had lived by them, fought for them, bled for them. The Yakuza world had promised him that honor would be his legacy, a mark that would live on after him, unshaken by time. Yet now, in the quietest of moments, he could see it for what it truly was, a shackle, a dead weight that had dragged him down through the darkest depths of his own destruction. Honor was a concept, a beautiful illusion crafted by men who thrived on control. He had been a fool, believing that it would be enough to sustain him, to keep him grounded. He had chosen the life of violence, of power, of betrayal, all in the name of honor. But what had it brought him? A fractured family, the blood of friends spilled across cold concrete, and an endless cycle of fear and retribution. Honor had never shielded him. It had always been a weapon used to enslave him, to keep him tied to a world where the only thing that mattered was survival, not ideals. It was as if the years of running, hiding, and fighting had finally opened his eyes to the truth. The world didn't care about his honor. The people who once revered it now saw it as a weakness. His name, once feared, was now whispered in regret. In the Yakuza, loyalty had been the currency, but loyalty was fickle. And in the end, it had cost him everything. The sacrifices, the betrayals, the bloodshed, it had all been in vain. What was left now? What honor could he claim after everything had been reduced to dust? The decision had come quietly, almost as if it had always been there, waiting for him to acknowledge it. He didn't need to follow the code anymore. Survival was the only thing left, and he would do whatever it took to keep breathing, to remain hidden from the ghosts of his past. He could not afford to cling to a relic of a life that had already buried him. The ideals he had once lived for had become nothing but a cage. Now, there was only escape. In the darkness of his apartment, alone with his thoughts, the protagonist stood before the mirror, his reflection a stranger. The man he had once been was slipping away, replaced by something raw, something desperate. Survival had become his new code. No more honor, no more loyalty, just the need to live, to find a way out before the weight of his past swallowed him whole. Honor had promised him greatness, but it had only brought him ruin. He would leave it behind now, as he had left everything else. All that mattered now was survival. The rest was irrelevant. The streets of Japan had never felt so cold, so indifferent. The life he had once known, vibrant with the pulse of power and fear, was now a fading memory. He walked the alleyways as if he was just another shadow in the city's maze, blending into the darkness that had become his only sanctuary. His steps were quiet, deliberate, as though even the sound of his presence might betray him. The Yakuza had cast him aside, his name now a curse in their world, and with every passing day, the past felt more distant. But the ghosts of his former life still haunted him, whispering through the cracks in his mind, urging him to return, to fight. But he was done with that life. The bloodshed, the betrayals, the endless cycle of violence, he had seen the end of it, and there was no going back. He wasn't a Yakuza anymore, and he never would be again. The man he had once been had died along with everything he had built. Now, he existed in the quiet spaces between the bustling streets, a phantom among the living, waiting for the world to forget. Yet, forgetting wasn't as simple as it seemed. The enemies he had made still hunted him. They were out there, always watching, always searching for the weakness they knew would bring him down. But they wouldn't find it. Not yet. He had learned the art of surviving in the shadows, of slipping through the cracks where even the most determined hunter couldn't follow. There were no names, no faces in this new life, only a set of rules that were his own to shape. The weight of his past pushed against him, a reminder that the world he had come from was never truly gone. The Yakuza were like a shadow that never fully dissipated, always lurking, always pulling him back into the darkness. But he refused to let it consume him again. He would not be their puppet, their pawn, anymore. The hours passed like smoke curling through the air, each moment blending into the next, indistinguishable and endless. He could feel the weight of the years, the mistakes, the choices he had made. But in this new world, the world of shadows, those choices didn't matter anymore. He was not bound by the rules of honor, loyalty, or family. He was free, at least for now. In the quietest moments, when his thoughts threatened to overtake him, he reminded himself of one truth. He had survived. And that was enough. The past could try to drag him back, but he would always slip through its grasp. He had walked the path of blood and shadows long enough to know that the only way out was forward, into the darkness where no one could follow. He was a ghost now, and ghosts don't fear the living. They simply fade into the night, waiting for the dawn. The night air was heavy, thick with the weight of choices that had been made. He stood on the rooftop, looking out over the city he once ruled, the city that had chewed him up and spit him out. His gaze swept over the neon lights, the streets he knew like the back of his hand, the places where his name had once commanded respect and fear. But those days were gone now. The Yakuza had abandoned him, and in return, he had chosen to leave them behind. The world had moved on, and so had he. His fingers gripped the edge of the rooftop, knuckles white from the tension. He had spent years entangled in the web of honor, loyalty, and violence that the Yakuza thrived on. The lessons had been brutal, but they had shaped him into the man he was now. He had learned the price of power, the cost of loyalty, and the consequences of living by a code that had no room for forgiveness. It had been a life of bloodshed and betrayal, a life that had almost claimed him in the end, but no more. The past was a weight he could no longer carry. The promises he had made, the oaths he had sworn, had all led him to this point. And now, standing on the edge of everything, he understood the truth. Honor was a double-edged sword. It had made him strong, but it had also destroyed him. It had given him purpose, but it had also stolen everything he had ever loved. He had learned the hard way that there was no redemption in the Yakuza's code, no place for weakness or doubt. The price of survival was far too high, but even as he made this vow, he couldn't shake the feeling that the Yakuza's shadow would always be there, lurking in the background, waiting to drag him back in. It wasn't just the family that had haunted him, it was the life itself, the violence, the betrayal, the constant fight for power. Those were the things that had shaped him. Those were the things that had made him who he was. But that man, the one who had lived and died by the Yakuza's rules, was gone. He had buried him in the darkness of his past. And now he was free. Free to live a life that was his own. Free to make his own choices. Free to forge a new path. He wasn't the demon the world had made him out to be. And he wasn't the puppet the Yakuza had tried to turn him into. As he turned away from the city below, the weight of his decision settled on him. He would never forget the lessons of the Yakuza, never forget the blood he had spilled, the friends he had lost, or the enemies he had made. But he had severed the ties. He had made his choice, and now it was time to walk away. The night was silent, save for the soft rustle of the wind. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight lift from his shoulders. And with that, he let go. The quiet of his new life was a foreign comfort. For the first time in years, he was free from the constant hum of danger, the weight of loyalty, the knives always waiting in the shadows. He had built a small, quiet existence, one that was his own, untangled from the blood-soaked threads of the Yakuza. But even in the silence, he could feel it. The past never truly let go. It started with the letters cryptic, unsigned, left at his door late at night. Then, the occasional shadow that seemed to linger just outside his vision, a figure passing by the corner of his eye. His heart would race, his mind would snap to attention, only to find that nothing was there. But he knew better. There was always something, someone. The ghosts of his past were more than just memories. They were ghosts made of flesh and blood, living in the spaces between his every step. The Yakuza had never truly let go of him, and it was only a matter of time before they came for him again. The lessons, the code, it had all been ingrained in him so deeply, so violently, that there was no real escape. Even in the quiet, even in this fragile peace, the ghosts of his former life would come calling. He had tried. He had tried so hard to bury that man, the one who had been the Yakuza's enforcer, the one who had killed and betrayed without question. But there were no burial grounds deep enough to keep him dead for long. In the back of his mind, he could still hear the murmurs of old enemies, still feel the weight of a life that demanded retribution. Even as he sat alone in his small apartment, the walls closed in on him with memories of blood, honor, and betrayal. His hand clenched into a fist as he stared out the window, the city lights flickering like 1,000 tiny fires burning in the distance. He could never escape that world, the one he had once ruled with cold precision. His heart, still a battleground between the man he had been and the man he longed to be, ached with the burden of his past. How many men had died at his hand? How many lives had he ruined? And for what? The doorbell rang, breaking his thoughts, and with it, the fragile peace he had tried to build. He stood up, slow and measured, as if preparing for another fight. A part of him knew what was coming. Old enemies were never too far behind. He walked to the door, his breath shallow, his heart steady. When he opened it, no one was there. Just another letter, left on the doorstep. Another sign that the past had found him, that the ghosts of his former life were not yet finished with him. As he picked it up, the weight of it pressed down on him. There was no escaping. Not now, not ever. The phone call came in the dead of night, the voice on the other end cold and unfamiliar. It wasn't the voice of an old ally or a former enemy, but something worse, something new. "Time to pay the price," the voice said, a chilling clarity cutting through the static. He sat in the dim light of his apartment, the shadows of his past closing in around him once more. It wasn't just the familiar weight of his old enemies that haunted him now. It was something more insidious, something darker. The past had finally come to collect its toll. The walls, once a shield, now felt like the bars of a cage. He had spent so long trying to outrun the darkness, only to find it waiting for him at every turn. The peaceful life he had built felt like a distant memory, a dream he had convinced himself was real. But the truth had always been lurking, just beneath the surface, and now it was stepping into the light. The message was clear. His past had not been buried, it had merely been waiting. The ghosts of his former life were rising, reshaping themselves into something new. The old rules, honor, loyalty had no place in this new world. The lines were blurred, the code was shattered. What was once a fight for survival was now a game of destruction, and he was a pawn in it. He couldn't outrun this, he couldn't hide. The shadows were no longer just memories, they were his new reality. His past had returned, but this time, it didn't care about honor or revenge. It only cared about one thing: power, and it would take everything from him to have it. His heart raced, not from fear, but from the quiet understanding that there was no way out. He had been living a lie, thinking that escaping the Yakuza's grip would grant him freedom. The truth was far darker. Freedom had never been an option. It had always been a myth, a story he had told himself to survive. Now, the story had unraveled, and the cold truth was standing before him. The phone call ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving only the sound of his breath and the weight of the silence. He looked around the room, the once safe haven now feeling like a tomb. There was no honor left to uphold, no family to protect, nothing but the shadows that had followed him here, whispering that he was never free. The darkness outside the window felt colder now, the city lights, distant and hollow. A new threat had emerged, one he hadn't seen coming, and this time, there was nothing left to fight for except survival. The weight of the past clung to him like a shadow, impossible to shake. He had hoped that his days of bloodshed were behind him, that the underworld's grip on his life had loosened. But when the call came, he knew there was no turning away. It was a name he hadn't heard in years, a name he once swore to never speak again. A new generation had risen in the Yakuza, and they were hungry. Hungry for power, hungry for control, and perhaps most dangerous of all, hungry for respect. They weren't bound by the same code he once lived by. They had no understanding of honor, only ambition and greed. The message was simple. His former life had caught up with him. The new Yakuza were coming for what they believed was theirs, and they were willing to burn everything down to claim it. They didn't care about old grudges or rivalries. They saw an opportunity to crush the remnants of the past, and he was a part of it. The protagonist had thought he was done with all of this. He had built a life outside the reach of the Yakuza, a life that felt like freedom. But the truth, as always, was that the Yakuza never let go of their own. Not truly. They were a part of him, and as much as he tried to deny it, his blood still ran with the same ruthless ambition. He stood in front of the mirror, the reflection staring back at him, a man who had lived and died 1,000 times over, but who was still very much alive, for better or worse. His hand hovered over the worn-out phone on the counter, his finger shaking just slightly as he reached for it. The call was inevitable, a necessary evil. The world he had tried so hard to escape was pulling him back in. The younger generation didn't understand the dangers of the old ways, the weight of the code that once defined their world. They thought they could move past it, rewrite the rules. But what they didn't understand was that every new generation had to pay the price for the sins of the old one. They would learn, the hard way, that the past never stayed buried. It always found a way to return. He dialed the number. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, cold, and full of arrogance. The new Yakuza didn't fear the consequences. They thought they were untouchable. But the protagonist knew better. He had seen the rise and fall of many like them. They were just children, playing with fire, unaware of the flames they were about to ignite. And now, once again, he was thrust back into the game. The old man was gone, the code fractured, but the streets still whispered his name. And with it, the reminder that the only way out was through the bloodshed, a path he had walked far too many times before. The night had a stillness to it that felt like an omen. Sitting alone in the dim light of his apartment, the protagonist stared at the empty glass in front of him. The ice inside long since melted. He had hoped that time would do what violence and bloodshed never could, erase the demons of his past. But they lingered, uninvited guests that never left, whispering in the silence, reminding him of the choices he had made and the paths he had walked. The memories came in flashes, brief, sharp images of faces and places, each one tied to a story of destruction. There was the young man he once was, wide-eyed and hungry, eager to prove his worth. And there was the man he had become, battle-worn and weary, the weight of his actions etched deep into his soul. He could still feel the pull of the Yakuza, the code that had once been everything to him. It had defined him, given him purpose, even as it slowly tore him apart. Each victory had come at a cost, each betrayal another cut in the slow, inevitable unraveling of his spirit. He thought of those he had loved, those he had lost, and wondered if they had ever truly understood the man he was becoming. The blood on his hands wasn't just from enemies, but from the very family he had sworn to protect. It was all tangled in a web of loyalty, honor, and ambition. And now, all that remained was the emptiness. He took a long, slow drink, savoring the bitter burn as it slid down his throat. The alcohol didn't numb the pain anymore. It only brought more memories. The faces of those who had trusted him, only to be abandoned in the end. The people he had betrayed, convinced that the Yakuza was all that mattered. Their voices still echoed in his mind, though he hadn't heard them in years. They were the ghosts he couldn't shake. The protagonist had been chasing something for so long, a version of himself that didn't exist anymore. Perhaps it had never existed at all. He had fought to climb to the top, to prove himself, to carve out a place in a world ruled by shadows. But now, as the years passed and the bloodshed faded into the past, he was left with nothing but the ghosts of his choices. Could he have done things differently? Would it have changed anything? The question lingered in his mind, but the answer was clear. No, the Yakuza had been a monster, and he had become its reflection. The demons he had fought, the lives he had taken, they would never leave. They were a part of him now, woven into his very being, like a scar that could never heal. And so, as the night stretched on, the protagonist sat in silence, alone with the weight of his past. The world had moved on, but he was still here, still fighting, still haunted by the choices that had shaped him. There was no redemption for a man like him, only the quiet, endless lament of a demon who would never be free. The sun had long set, casting a blanket of darkness over the city, but the night was alive with the pulse of impending conflict. The protagonist stood on the rooftop, his eyes scanning the streets below. It felt familiar, the anticipation, the quiet before the storm. But this time, there would be no escaping, no more running, no more hiding. His time had come. The new Yakuza, younger and hungrier, had risen to take everything he had fought for. They were a brutal breed, uncaring of the old codes, merciless in their quest for power. They were everything he had once been, but without honor, without the restraints that had kept him human. The world had changed, and so had the game. What had been sacred to him had become nothing more than a relic of the past. And now, they stood in his way, ready to crush him without hesitation. He knew there would be no redemption. This wasn't about saving face or dying with honor. It wasn't about the Yakuza code or any false ideals. This was survival, pure and simple. The new generation had their own rules, and in their eyes, he was nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. But he wasn't going to go down quietly. The protagonist adjusted the grip on the gun at his side, feeling the cold steel in his palm. His body was older now, aching in ways it never used to, but the fire in his chest still burned as fiercely as ever. It was time to end this. He had lived too long with the weight of his past, too long under the shadows of his own mistakes. This would be his final act, his last chance to strike back. The sound of distant footsteps echoed through the alley below, growing louder with every passing second. His enemies were closing in. They thought they had him cornered, but they didn't understand this was his world, his fight. He had walked through fire before and emerged from the flames, stronger, more resolute. He wasn't afraid of death. It was the only thing he had ever been sure of. The door behind him creaked open, and two of the younger Yakuza men stepped into view, their eyes cold, devoid of the hesitation that marked the old ways. They were ready to kill, and they knew he was ready to die. But before they could react, the protagonist was already in motion, his training kicking in with brutal efficiency. Shots rang out, loud in the silent night, each one cutting through the air with deadly precision. But it wasn't enough. They were too many, and even as he fought, even as he bled, he knew he couldn't win. The world had moved on. The Yakuza he had once known was no more. This fight wasn't for survival, it was for closure. And as the last of his strength ebbed away, he knew that in the end, he was nothing more than another ghost in the streets of the city he had tried to rule. The sound of sirens wailed in the distance, but they were too late. The protagonist had already given his last stand, and in the end, the shadows of the Yakuza would swallow him whole. The city felt different now. It wasn't the same pulse, the same life that once coursed through its streets. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered in every corner, in every shadow. The sounds of violence, of power, of the Yakuza world, those sounds had fallen silent. The battle was over, but its consequences remained. The protagonist's body lay cold, somewhere between life and death, in the same streets he had fought for, killed for, and bled for. His final breath was the last whisper of a world that no longer had a place for him. The Yakuza, that sacred, cursed brotherhood, would never be the same. The storm had washed it clean, leaving nothing but ruins in its wake. His legacy was sealed in blood, but it would be remembered in silence. No one spoke of him in the same way anymore. They didn't speak of the man he had been or the monster he had become. In the end, it was hard to separate the two. Honor had been both his salvation and his curse. It had kept him alive when others would have fallen, but it also dragged him deeper into the darkness. He had believed in it, once believed that the Yakuza code, the honor of the family, was everything. But now, in the quiet aftermath, it all seemed like a lie. His death was the end of an era, but it was the beginning of something different, something darker. The streets that had once feared him, that had watched him rise, now stood silent. The younger generation of Yakuza moved in, ruthless, unfeeling, and without the honor he had once carried. Their eyes were on power, not on tradition. They didn't care for the blood that had been spilled to get them here. They didn't care for the old ways. They had inherited the empire, but none of them had the soul of the man who had built it. His final stand, his last battle, had ensured that the world he had known would burn to the ground. And yet, even as the city tried to move on, even as the new Yakuza flourished in the ashes, there was something else that lingered, something unspoken. It was the memory of the man who had once been at the center of it all, a figure who had wielded power with both grace and brutality, a man who had been feared, revered, and, in the end, forgotten. The silence after the storm was deafening. The streets would never forget him, but they would never speak his name again. In the end, he had become a shadow, a cautionary tale whispered on the lips of the few who still remembered. The world would change, but his legacy would remain, etched in the city's blood and bones, forever haunting the quiet places where power once reigned. The air felt thicker now, as though the weight of the past had finally caught up to him. He had survived, yes, but survival, he now understood, was an illusion. It wasn't about escaping the world you'd built. It was about living with the scars it left behind. Every step forward was a reminder that nothing, not even life, was untouched by the choices he had made. His hands trembled slightly as he ran them over the cold surface of a window, looking out over the city he had once controlled. The streets below were still, the skyline unremarkable. The world moved on, but for him, it felt frozen, hollow. Survival had been the instinct that kept him alive, that drove him through every battle, every betrayal. But now, the cost was undeniable. He had walked away from the flames, only to find that the ashes had burned deeper into his soul than he ever realized. The people he had lost, the faces that haunted him, each piece of his past had twisted him into someone he barely recognized. The honor, the blood, the violence, it was all part of him now. He couldn't erase it. No matter how far he ran, no matter how much he tried to escape the echoes of his former life, the world had changed, but he hadn't. He stood there, staring at the city, watching life unfold, unaware of the monster still lurking in the heart of it all. A monster who had once been a king, but now was just another ghost. He had thought that surviving would bring peace, but it only brought silence. The people who once followed him, once feared him, were either gone or had moved on. The world didn't need him anymore, and that hurt more than he could bear. The Yakuza he had once led had splintered, the power he had known slipping from his grasp, leaving him with nothing but his past. Nothing had changed in the city, yet everything had changed for him. His survival, his escape from the life he had once fought so hard to hold, now felt like a death sentence. Every day was a struggle not to fall into the abyss. He had no allies left, no family to call his own. The blood that once bound him to the Yakuza now weighed him down, dragging him further into the shadows. He had survived the war, the betrayals, the killings, but survival came with a terrible price. The life he had known, the man he had been, was gone. What was left was a hollow shell, haunted by ghosts and memories of a time when he had believed he was invincible. Now, he was just a man trying to outrun his past, knowing that no matter how far he went, it would always be there, lurking in the shadows. The world had moved on, and he had become a shadow of a past that no longer held any weight. It was a strange kind of solitude that settled over him, one that wasn't defined by silence, but by a loud, persistent absence. The man he once was, the feared Yakuza boss, the one whose name carried weight in every corner of the underworld, no longer existed. He had become a relic, a fading memory in the minds of those who had once bowed to him. The street corners, once filled with whispers of his power, now held nothing but the hum of a city growing too fast for anyone to keep up. He walked the streets, unnoticed, blending in with the crowd. The jacket he wore now felt too big, the weight of his past no longer held by the shoulders that once carried it with pride. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he was afraid to be recognized, afraid of what it would mean if someone saw through the mask he had carefully crafted for himself. In his eyes was a reflection of all that he had lost: his empire, his allies, his honor. But more than that, there was a quiet understanding that peace, the thing he had searched for so long, was elusive. It had been replaced by something far more terrifying: emptiness, He couldn't go back, couldn't return to the world that had once been his. The streets that had once been filled with his enemies, his friends, his allies now felt alien. He didn't belong here anymore. Not in this world. Not in the life he had once lived. The smell of the city, the sounds of the neon lights and the low murmurs of the crowd, nothing felt real anymore. There was no purpose, no direction. Every step he took only led him further into the void. He had been left behind by the world, but more than that, he had left himself behind. The bloodshed, the endless battles, the betrayals, it had all been for nothing. There was no glory in survival. The weight of it all pressed against his chest, suffocating him with its finality. He thought that by walking away, by leaving the Yakuza behind, he could find peace. But all he found was this lingering emptiness, a quiet place where memories of violence and loyalty never quite faded, never quite disappeared. And so he kept walking, the ghost of a man once powerful, now lost in the shadow of everything he had left behind. The world no longer looked at him, and he no longer looked at the world. He had become a piece of the city, part of the forgotten past. No one cared about his story, no one sought him out, and somewhere deep within, he accepted that peace wasn't meant for men like him. Some ghosts never fade. The world had no use for him anymore, and he no longer had any use for the world. Time had erased most of his past, leaving only fragments of memories that haunted him in the quietest hours of the night. The violence, the betrayals, the empire he had built, it was all distant now, like a dream that had slipped through his fingers. There was nothing left to prove. No final showdown awaited him, no grand gesture to redeem his name. Redemption, he realized, was not something that could be granted by others. It wasn't found in the approval of those he had once called allies, or the vengeance against those who had wronged him. It wasn't in reclaiming a lost honor, or in the eyes of those who feared him. Redemption was found in the quietest corners of a man's heart, in the moments of reflection when the noise of the world faded away, leaving only the whisper of regret. He had spent so many years seeking approval from the wrong places, trying to fill the emptiness with power, with bloodshed, with loyalty that was nothing more than a cage. Now, the cage was empty. It was just him, alone, facing a future that had no promises, no guarantees. The past had been cruel, but it had also been a teacher. It had shown him what it meant to be lost, to be someone whose name struck fear in the hearts of all who heard it. And now, in the silence that followed, he could see how hollow that life had truly been. He made no effort to chase redemption in grand displays. There was no need to face the world and declare his change. He knew what he had to do, and it was a quiet thing. The people who mattered to him, the ones who had stayed, the ones who had never turned away, were gone. It wasn't about them anymore. It was about him and the long path he had to walk alone, seeking something that couldn't be touched, only felt. He gave away the last of the wealth he had hoarded for years, the money that had meant power to him once. He helped those in need, not because it would make him feel better, but because for the first time he understood the weight of having something and then giving it away. He sought peace, not through violence, but through humility. As the days passed, his journey became less about finding forgiveness and more about forgiving himself. No one would ever know the full extent of his change. There would be no ceremony, no applause. His name, once known by all, was now a faint echo in the corners of the city. But in the stillness, where his heart used to be heavy, he finally felt the burden lifting. Redemption, he realized, was never about the world. It was always about him, and in that quiet moment of surrender, he found what he had been searching for all along. The weight of the years settled heavily on his shoulders, like a stone he had carried for far too long. The ghosts of his past, the people he had hurt, the choices he had made, all of it had followed him, clinging to him like shadows that never fully faded. For so long, he had run from it, buried it beneath layers of pride, anger, and power. But now, standing at the edge of the life he had known, he realized there was no escaping the one thing that had always been with him: himself. The demon inside him had always been there. It was the fire that fueled his rise, the darkness that made him untouchable, the drive that had pushed him to the top of the world, only to watch it all crumble beneath him. It was his hunger, his need for control, his belief that the world would bend to his will if he was strong enough to make it. But now, standing alone in the quiet, with nothing but the remnants of his life around him, he understood. The greatest enemy he had ever faced wasn't the rival gangs, the betrayal of his closest allies, or the ghosts of the past. It was the man staring back at him in the mirror, the man who had done all of this to himself. There was no one else to blame anymore. The world had shifted, moved on, and he had been left behind, still trapped in the spiral of choices he had made. He had spent his life trying to outrun the consequences, to fight against what he had become. But now, in this moment, he understood that the only thing left to do was face it. The demon was not some external force, a monster lurking in the shadows, waiting to pounce. It was in his heart, in every action, every decision he had made. It was the part of him that had reveled in the violence, that had seen loyalty as a tool and honor as a weapon. It had pushed him to destroy everything, to build a kingdom that was nothing more than a house of cards, teetering on the edge of collapse. The demon had been there when he turned his back on love, when he chose power over the people who mattered, when he buried his humanity in the pursuit of dominance. And now, as the weight of it all pressed down on him, he knew the only way to silence the demon was to let it go, to accept that he was not the man he had once believed himself to be, to release the rage, the regret, the hunger for more, to forgive himself even when no one else ever would. The final battle wasn't with anyone else, it was with himself. And as he stood there, alone in the silence, he finally understood that the only way out was to walk away from the past. The demon had been defeated, not by violence, but by the simple act of letting go. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the city he had once ruled. The streets were quieter now, the familiar hum of violence and power replaced by a silence that felt heavier than any noise he had known. He walked through it, a ghost of the man he used to be, his steps slow and deliberate, as if he was afraid to disturb the calm. The world had moved on, just as he had always known it would, but it hadn't done so without leaving traces of him behind, traces that would never fade, no matter how far he walked from the past. Honor, once a force that had driven him forward, now seemed like a distant memory. It had been a guiding star, leading him to the top of the Yakuza, but it had also been a chain, binding him to a world of violence, betrayal, and loss. He had spent his life fighting for it, believing it was the only thing that mattered. But now, standing on the precipice of everything he had built and destroyed, he realized how fragile that concept was. Honor, in the end, had been a mask, a way to justify the horrors he had committed, a way to convince himself he was still in control. But as the silence settled around him, he knew that it had never been the answer. His hands, once steady and sure, now trembled with the weight of his choices. There were no more enemies to fight, no more scores to settle. The world he had shaped with blood and fire had crumbled, and all that was left was the quiet, the absence of everything he had known, his family, his allies, his enemies all gone. The Yakuza's legacy, which had once seemed unbreakable, was now nothing more than a fading whisper on the wind. He had never wanted peace, never believed it was possible. The man who had risen from the ashes of poverty, built an empire from nothing, had always thrived on chaos. But now, the chaos had caught up with him, and all he had left was the empty space between his breaths. The myth of the Yakuza, of honor, of power, none of it mattered anymore. In the end, he was just a man, broken, and alone, trying to find a place in a world that no longer had a place for him. As he walked through the streets, he could almost hear the whispers, the stories still told in the dark corners of the city. The myth would live on, even if the man had disappeared. His name would be spoken in reverence and fear, just as it always had been, but he would be nothing more than a shadow, a legend without a face. The world moved on, but the silence was his final tribute.